had not yet learned all she could. Ralph Hart was a man who had accepted challenges and had learned everything, and now he was asking this woman, this prostitute, this understanding mother, to save him. How absurd. Other men had behaved like this with her. Many of them had been unable to have an erection, others had wanted to be treated like children, others had said that they would like her to be their wife because it excited them to know that she had had so many lovers. Although she had still not met any of the special clients, she had already discovered the vast universe of fantasies that fills the human soul. But they were all used to their worlds and none of them had said to her, "Take me away from here." On the contrary, they wanted to take Maria with them, and even though those many men had always left her with money, but drained of energy, she must have learned something. If one of them had really been looking for love, and if sex really was only part of that search, how would she like to be treated? What did she think should happen on a first meeting? What would she really like to happen? "I'd like a gift," said Maria. Ralph Hart didn't understand. A gift? He had already paid for that night in advance, while they were in the taxi, because he knew the ritual. What did she mean? Maria had suddenly realized that she knew, at that moment, what a man and a woman needed to feel. She took his hand and led him into one of the sitting rooms. "We won't go up to the bedroom," she said. She turned out almost all the lights, sat down on the carpet and asked him to sit down opposite her. She noticed that there was a fire in the room. "Light the fire." "But it's summer." "Light the fire. You asked me to guide our steps tonight and that's what I'm doing." She gave him a steady look, hoping that he would again see her light. He obviously did, because he went out into the garden, collected some wood still wet with rain, and picked up some old newspapers so that the fire would dry the wood and get it to burn. He went into the kitchen to fetch more whiskey, but Maria called him back. "Did you ask me what I wanted?" "No, I didn't." "Well, the person you're with has to exist too. Think of her. Think if she wants whiskey or gin or coffee. Ask her what she wants. What would you like to drink?" "Wine." "And why'd he like you to keep me company?" He put down the whiskey bottle and returned with a bottle of wine. By this time, the fire was already beginning to burn. Maria turned out the few remaining lights, so that the flames were the only illumination in the room. She behaved as if she had always known that this was the first step, recognizing the other person and knowing that he or she was there. She opened her handbag and found inside a pen she had bought in a supermarket. "Anything would do. This is for you. I bought it so that I could note down some ideas about farm management. I used it for 2 days, I worked until I was too tired to work anymore. It contains some of my sweat, some of my concentration and my willpower, and I'm giving it to you now." She placed the pen gently in his hand. "Instead of buying something that you would like to have, I'm giving you something that is mine, truly mine. A gift. A sign of respect for the person before me, asking him to understand how important it is to be by his side. Now he has a small part of me with him, which I gave him with my free, spontaneous will." Ralph got up, went over to a shelf and returned, carrying something. He held it out to Maria. "This is a carriage belonging to an electric train set I had when I was a child. I wasn't allowed to play with it on my MVN, because my father said it had been imported from the United States and was very expensive. So I had to wait until he felt like setting up the train in the living room, but he spent most Sundays listening to opera. That's why the train survived my childhood, but never gave me any happiness. I've still got all the track, the engine, the houses, even the manual, because I had a train that wasn't mine and with which I never played. I wish RD destroyed it along with all the other toys I was given and which RVE since forgotten all about, because that passion for destruction is part of how a child discovers the world. But this pristine train set always reminds me of a part of my childhood that I never lived, because it was too precious and it meant too much work for my father. Or perhaps it was just that whenever he set the train up, he was afraid he might show his love for me." Maria began staring into the fire. Something was happening, and it wasn't just the wine or the cozy atmosphere. It was that exchange of gifts. Ralph turned to the fire too. They said nothing, listening to the crackle of the flames. They drank their wine, as if it didn't matter that they said nothing, did nothing. They were just there, together, staring in the same direction. "I have a lot of pristine train sets in my life too," said Maria, after a while. "One of them is my heart. And I only played with it when the world set out the tracks, and then it wasn't always the right moment." "But you loved." "Oh, yes, I loved very deeply. I loved so deeply that when my love asked me for a gift, I took fright and fled." "I don't understand." "You don't have to. I'm teaching you because I've discovered something I didn't know before. The giving of gifts. Giving something of one's own. Giving something important rather than asking. You have my treasure, the pen with which I wrote down some of my dreams. I have your treasure, the carriage of a train, part of your childhood that you did not live. I carry with me part of your past, and you carry with you a little of my present. Isn't that lovely?" She said all the eyes without blinking, and without surprise, as if she had known for ages that this was the best and only way to behave. She got lightly to her feet, took her jacket from the coat rack and kissed Ralph on the cheek. Ralph's heart did not make any move to get up, hypnotized by the fire, perhaps thinking about his father. "I never understood why I kept that carriage. Now I do. It was in order to give it to you one night before an open fire. Now the house feels lighter." He said that the next day he would give the rest of the tracks, engines, smoke pills, to some children's home. "It could be a rarity, of a kind that isn't made anymore, it could be worth a lot of money," said Maria, but immediately regretted her words. That wasn't what mattered, the point was to free yourself from something that cost your heart even more. Before she said anything else that did not quite chime with the moment, she again kissed him on the cheek and walked to the front door. He was still gazing into the fire, and she had to ask him softly if he would open the door for her. Ralph got up, and she explained that, although she was glad to see him staring into the fire, Brazilians have a strange superstition: when you visit someone for the first time, you must not the one to open the door when you leave, because if you do, you will never return to that house. And I want to come back. Although we didn't take our clothes off and I didn't come inside you, or even touch you, we've made love." She laughed. He offered to take her home, but she refused. "I'll come and see you tomorrow, then, at the Copacabana." "No, don't. Wait a week. I've learned that waiting is the most difficult bit, and I want to get used to the feeling, knowing that you're with me, even when you're not by my side." She walked back through the cold and the dark, as she had so many times before in Geneva. Normally, these walks were associated with sadness, loneliness, the desire to go back to Brazil, financial calculations, timetables, nostalgia for the language she hadn't spoken freely for ages. Now, though, she was walking in order to find herself, to find that woman who had sat with a man by a fire for 40 minutes and who was full of light, wisdom, experience, and charm. She had seen that woman's face a long time ago, when she was walking by the lakeside wondering whether or not she should devote herself to a life that wasn't hers. On that afternoon, the woman had a terribly sad smile on her face. She had seen her for a second time on that folded canvas, and now she was with her again. She only caught a taxi after she had walked quite a way, when the magic presence had gone, leaving her alone again, as usual. It was best not to think too much about it all, so as not to spoil it, so as not to let the beauty of what she had just experienced be replaced by anxiety. If that other Maria really existed, she would return when the moment was right. An extract from the diary Maria W. wrote on the night she was given the train carriage: "IJ profound desire, true desire is the desire to be close to someone. From that point onwards, things change, FL the man and the woman come into play, but what M1 happens before, the attraction that brought them together, is impossible to explain. It is untouched desire in its purest state. When desire is still in this pure state, the man and the woman fall in love with life, they live each moment reverently, consciously, always ready to celebrate the next blessing. When people feel like this, they are not in a hurry, they do not precipitate events with unthinking actions. They know that the inevitable will happen, that what is real always finds a way of revealing itself. When the moment comes, they do not hesitate, they do not miss an opportunity, they do not let slip a single magic moment, because they respect the importance of each second. If in the days that followed, Maria found herself once more caught in the trap she had tried so hard to avoid, but she felt neither sad nor concerned. On the contrary, now that she had nothing to lose, she was free. She knew that, however romantic the situation, one day, Ralph Hart would realize that she was just a prostitute, while he was a respected artist, that she lived in a far-off country that was in a state of permanent crisis, while he lived in paradise, with his life organized and protected from birth. He had received his education in the best schools, museums, and art galleries of the world, while she had barely finished secondary school. Dreams like theirs never lasted long, and Maria had enough experience of life to know that reality usually chose not to fit in with her dreams. And that was now her great joy, to say to reality that she didn't need it, that she was no longer dependent on what happened in order to be happy. God, I'm such a romantic. During the week, she tried to think of something that would make Ralph Hart happy, for he had restored to her a dignity and a light that she thought were lost forever. But the only way she had of repaying him was with the thing he thought was her speciality, sex. Since there was little to inspire her in the routine at the Copacabana, she decided to look elsewhere. She again went to see a few porn movies, and again found nothing of interest in them, apart, perhaps, from the varying number of people involved. When films proved of no help, she decided, for the first time since she had arrived in Geneva, to buy some books, although she still didn't see the point in cluttering up her apartment with something which, once read, had no further use. She went to the bookshop she had seen when she and Ralph had walked down the road to Santiago, and asked if they had any books about sex. "Oh, loads," said the shop assistant. "In fact, it seems to be all people care about. There's a special section devoted to the subject, but in just about every other novel you can see around you there's always at least one sex scene. Whether it's hidden away in pretty little love stories or discussed in serious tomes on human behavior, it appears to be all anyone thinks." Maria, with all her experience, knew that the woman was wrong. People wanted to think like that. They thought sex was everyone else's sole concern. They went on diets, wore wigs, spent hours at the hairdresser's or at the gym, put on sexy clothes, all in an attempt to awaken the necessary spark. And what happened? When the moment came to go to bed with someone, 11 minutes later it was all over. There was no creativity involved, nothing that would lift them up to paradise. The fire provoked by the spark soon burned out. But there was no point arguing with the young blonde woman, who believed that the world could be explained in books. She asked to be directed to the special section, and there she found various books about gay men, lesbians, nuns revealing scandals in the church, illustrated showing Oriental techniques, all involving extremely uncomfortable positions, but only one of the titles interested her, Sacred Sex. At least it was different. She bought it, went home, tuned to a particular radio station that always helped her to think, because they played such calming music, opened the book and noticed various illustrations, showing postures that only a circus performer could possibly hope to achieve. The text itself was very dull. Maria had learned enough in her profession to know that not everything in life is a matter of what position you adopt when making love, and that any variation usually occurs naturally, without thinking, like the steps in a dance. Nevertheless, she tried to concentrate on what she was reading. 2 hours later, she had come to envo conclusions. First, she needed to eat supper, because she had to get back to the Copacabana. Second, the person who had written the book clearly understood nothing, absolutely nothing about the subject. It was just a lot of empty theory, Oriental nonsense, pointless rituals, and idiotic suggestions. She noticed that the author had studied meditation in the Himalayas. She must find out where they were, attended courses in yoga, she had heard of that, and had obviously read widely in the subject, for she kept quoting other authors, but she had failed to learn what was essential. Sex wasn't theories, incense, erogenous zones, bows and salams. How did that person, a woman, have the nerve to write on a subject which not even Maria, who worked in the field, knew in depth? Perhaps it was all the fault of the Himalayas or the need to complicate something whose very beauty lay in simplicity and passion. If that woman could get away with publishing and selling such a stupid book, perhaps she should think seriously again about writing her 0 millimeters, 11 minutes. It wouldn't be cynical or false, it would just be her story. But she had neither the time nor the interest. She needed to focus her energies on making Ralph Hart happy and on learning how to manage a farm. From Maria's diary, just after abandoning the boring book, I've met a man and fallen in love with him. I allowed myself to fall in love for one simple reason: I'm not expecting anything to come of it. I know that, in 3 months' time, I'll be far away and he'll be just a memory, but I couldn't stand living without love any longer. I had reached my limit. I'm writing a story for Ralph Hart, that's his name. I'm not sure he'll come back to the club where I work, but, for the first time in my life, that doesn't matter. It's enough just to love him, to be with him in my thoughts and to color this lovely city with his steps, his words, his love. When I leave this country, it will have a face and a name and the memory of a fireplace. Everything else I experienced here, all the difficulties I had to overcome, will be as nothing compared to that memory. I would like to do for him what he did for me. I've been thinking about it a lot, and I realized that I didn't go into that cafe by chance. Really important meetings are planned by the souls long before the bodies see each other. Generally speaking, these meetings occur when we reach a limit, when we need to die and be reborn emotionally. These meetings are waiting for us, but more often than not, we avoid them happening. If we are desperate, though, if we have nothing to lose, or if we are full of enthusiasm for life, then the unknown reveals itself, and our universe changes direction. Everyone knows how to love, because we are all born with that gift. Some people have a natural talent for it, but the majority of us have to relearn, to remember how to love, and everyone, without exception, needs to burn on the bonfire of past emotions, to relieve certain joys and griefs, certain ups and downs, until they can see the connecting tirade that exists behind each new encounter, because there is a connecting thread. And then, our bodies learn to speak the language of the soul, known as sex, and that is what I can give to the man who gave me back my soul, even though he has no idea how important he is to my life. That is what he asked me for, and that is what he will have. I want him to be very happy. Sometimes life is very mean. A person can spend days, weeks, months, and years without feeling anything new. Then, when a door opens, as happened with Maria when she met Ralph Hart, a positive avalanche pours in. One moment, you have nothing; the next, you have more than you can cope with. 2 hours after writing her diary, when she arrived at work, and Philin, the mvner, came looking for her. "So you went out with that painter, did you?" Ralph was obviously known at the club. She had realized this when he paid the rate for 3 customers, without having to ask the price. Maria merely nodded, trying to act mysterious, but Milan took no notice. He knew this life better than she did. "Perhaps you're ready for the next stage. There's a special client of ours who has often asked about you. I told him that you're not experienced enough, and he believed me, but perhaps now is the moment to try." "A special client? What's this got to do with the painter?" "He's a special client too." So everything she had done with Ralph Hart had already been done by one of her colleagues. She bit her lip and said nothing. She had had a lovely week, and she must not forget what she had written. "Should I do the same thing I did with him?" "I don't know what you did, but tonight, if someone offers you a drink, say no. Special clients pay more, you won't regret it." Work started as it always did. The Thai women all sat together. The Colombians adopted their usual air of knowing everything. The 3 Brazilians, including her, looked absently about them, as if nothing could ever surprise or interest them. Apart from them, there was an Austrian, 2 Germans, and the rest were tall, pretty women with pale eyes who came from the former Eastern Bloc countries and who always seemed to find husbands more quickly than the others. The men began to arrive, Russian, Swiss, German, all of them busy executives, well able to afford the services of the most expensive prostitutes in one of the most expensive cities in the world. Some came over to her table, but she kept her eye on Enfilin, who shook his head. Maria was pleased. Tonight, she wouldn't have to open her legs, put up with smells or take showers in sometimes chilly bathrooms. All she had to do was to teach a man grown weary of sex how to make love. And when she thought about it, not every woman would have been creative enough to come up with that story about the exchange of gifts. At the same time, she was wondering, why is it that, having experienced everything, these men want to go right back to the start? Not that this was her concern, as long as they paid well, she was there to serve them. A man came in, younger than Ralph Hart. He was good-looking, with dark hair, perfect teeth, and wearing what looked like a Mao jacket, no tie, just a high collar and, underneath, an impeccable white shirt. He went up to the bar, where both he and Milan turned to look at Maria, then he came over. "Would you like a drink?" She saw Milan nod, and so invited the man to sit down at her table. She ordered a fruit juice cocktail and waited for him to ask her to dance. Then the man introduced himself. "My name is Terence, and I work for a record company in England. Since I assume I'm in a place where I can trust the personnel, I take it this will remain entirely between you and me." Maria was about to start talking about Brazil, but he interrupted her. "Milan says you understand what I want." "I've no idea what you want, but I know my job." They did not follow the usual ritual. He paid the bill, took her arm, and they got into a taxi, where he gave her 1,000 francs. For a moment, she remembered the Arab man with whom she had gone to the restaurant full of Mao's paintings. It was the first time she had received the same amount of money, and instead of making her feel glad, it made her feel nervous. The taxi stopped outside one of the most expensive hotels in the city. The man greeted the porter and seemed totally at ease in the place. They went straight up to his room, a suite with a view over the river. He opened a bottle of wine, possibly a rare vintage, and offered her a glass. Maria watched him while he drank. What did a rich, good-looking man like him want with a prostitute? Since he barely spoke, she too remained largely silent, trying to work out what would make a special client happy. She knew that she should not take the initiative, but once the process had begun, she needed to be able to follow his lead as quickly as possible. After all, it wasn't every night that she earned 1,000 francs. "We've got plenty of time," Terence said. "All the time in the world. You can sleep here if you like." Her feelings of insecurity returned. The man did not seem in the least intimidated, and, unlike her other customers, he spoke very calmly. He knew what he wanted. He put on the perfect piece of music, at the perfect volume, in the perfect room, with the perfect window, which looked out onto the lake of a perfect city. His suit was well tailored. His suitcase was there in the corner, very small, as if he always traveled light, or as if he had come to Geneva just for that one night. "I'll sleep at home," Maria said. The man opposite her changed completely. An icy glint came into his hitherto gentlemanly eyes. "Sit there," he said, indicating a chair by the desk. It was an order. A real order. Maria obeyed and, oddly enough, she felt excited. "Sit properly. Back straight, like a lady. If you don't, I'll punish you." Punish her. Special client. In a flash, she understood everything, took the 1,000 francs out of her bag and put it down on the desk. "I know what you want," she said, looking deep into those cold, blue eyes. "And I won't do it." The man seemed to return to his normal self, and he could see that she was telling the truth. "Have a drink of wine," he said. "I won't force you to do anything. You can either stay a little longer, if you like, or you can leave." That made her feel I have a job. I have a boss who protects and trusts me. "I'd be grateful if you didn't say anything to him," Maria said, eyes without a hint of pleading or self-pity in her voice. It was simply how things were. Terence was once again the man she had first met, neither gentle nor harsh, just someone who, unlike her other clients, gave the impression that he knew what he wanted. He seemed to emerge from a trance, from a play that had scarcely begun. Was it worth leaving now and never finding out the truth about this special client? What exactly did you want? You know what I want. Pain. Suffering. And a great deal of pleasure. Pain and suffering don't normally go with pleasure, Maria thought. And yet she desperately wanted to believe that they did, and thus make a positive out of her many negative experiences. He took her by the hand and led her over to the window. On the other side of the lake they could see a cathedral spire. Maria remembered passing it when she had walked the road to Santiago with Ralph Hart. You see the river, the lake, the houses, and the church? Well, it was all pretty much the same 500 years ago, except that the city was deserted. A strange disease had spread throughout Europe, and no one knew why so many people were dying. They began to call the disease the Black Death, sent by God because of mankind's sins. Then a group of people decided to sacrifice themselves for the sake of humanity. They offered the thing they most feared, physical pain. They began to spend days and nights walking across these bridges, along these streets, beating their own bodies with whips and chains. They were suffering in the name of God and praising God with their pain. They soon realized that they were happier doing this than baking bread, working in the fields or feeding their animals. Pain was no longer a cause of suffering, but a source of pleasure because they were redeeming humanity from its sins. Pain became joy, the meaning of life, pleasure. 11 minutes his eyes grew cold again. He picked up the money she had put down on the desk, separated out 150 francs and put those in her bag. Don't worry about your boss. Here's his commission, and I promise I won't say anything. You can leave now. She grabbed the money back. It was the wine, the Arab man in the restaurant, the woman with the sad smile, the idea that she would never ever return to this wretched place, the fear of a new love that was coming to her in the shape of a man, the letters to her mother telling of a wonderful life full of job opportunities, the boy from her childhood who had asked her for a pencil, the struggles with herself, the guilt, the curiosity, the money, the search to discover her own limits, and all the missed chances and opportunities. Another Maria was there now. She was no longer offering gifts, she was offering herself up as a sacrifice. I'm not afraid anymore. Let's carry on. If necessary, you can punish me for my rebelliousness. I've lied and betrayed and maligned the very person who protected and loved me. She was entering into the spirit of the game. She was saying the right things. Kneel down, said Terence in a low, chilling voice. Maria obeyed. She had never been treated this way, and she didn't know if it was good or bad, only that she wanted to go forward. She deserved to be humiliated for all she had done in her life. She was entering a role, becoming a different person, a woman she did not know at all. You will be punished because you are useless, because you don't know the rules and because you know nothing about sex, life, or love. While he was speaking, Terence was transformed into two very different men. The one who was calmly explaining the rules to her and the one who made her feel like the most miserable wretch in the world. Do you know why I am doing this? Because there is no greater pleasure than that of initiating someone into an unknown world. Taking someone's virginity, the virginity not of their body, but of their soul, you understand. She understood. Today you can ask questions, but the next time, when the theater curtain goes up, the play will and cannot be stopped. If it does stop, it is because your souls are incompatible. Remember, it is a play. You must be the person you have never had the courage to be. Gradually, you will discover that you are that person, but until you can see this clearly, you must pretend and invent. What if I can't stand the pain? There is no pain, only something that transforms itself into delight and mystery. It forms part of the play to say, don't treat me like that, you're really hurting me. As is, stop, I can't take any more. In order to avoid danger. He broke off at this point and said, keep your head down, don't look at me. Maria, kneeling, lowered her head and stared at the floor. In order to avoid DI's relationship causing any serious physical harm, we have two code words. If one of us says yellow, that means that the violence should be decreased slightly. If one of us says red, it must stop at once. You said one of us, we take turns. One cannot exist without the other. No one can know how to humiliate another person if they themselves have not experienced humiliation. These were terrible words, from a world she did not know, full of shadow, slime, and putrefaction. Nevertheless, she wanted to go on. Her body was trembling with fear and excitement. Terence placed his hand on her head with unexpected tenderness. "That's all." He asked her to get up, not particularly kindly, but not with the same brusque aggression he had shown before. Still trembling, Maria put on her jacket. Terence noticed the state she was in. "Have a cigarette before you go." Nothing happened. "It doesn't need to. It will start to happen in your soul, and the next time we meet, you will be ready." Was tonight worth 1,000 francs? He didn't reply. He too lit a cigarette and they finished the wine, listening to the perfect music, savoring the silence together, until the moment came to say something, and when it did, Maria was surprised by her own words. "I don't understand why I want to step into this slime." 1,000 francs. No, that's not the reason. Terence seemed pleased with this response. "I've asked myself the same thing. The Marquis de Sade said that the most important experiences a man can have are those that take him to the very limit. That is the only way we learn, because it requires all our courage. When a boss humiliates an employee, or a man humiliates his wife, he is merely being cowardly or taking his revenge on life. They are people who have never dared to look into the depths of their soul, never attempted to know the origin of that desire to unleash the wild beast, or to understand that sex, pain, and love are all extreme experiences. Only those who know those frontiers know life. Everything else is just passing the time, repeating the same tasks, growing old and dying without ever having discovered what we are doing here. In the street again, in the cold again, and again that desire to walk. The man was wrong. It wasn't necessary to know your 0mrn demons in order to find God. She passed a group of students coming out of a bar. They were all happy and slightly tipsy. They were all good-looking and bursting with health. Soon they would finish university and start what people call real life. Work, marriage, children, television, bitterness, old age, the sense of having lost many things, frustrations, illness, disability, dependence on others, loneliness, death. What was happening? She too was looking for the peace in which to live her real life. The time spent in Switzerland, doing something she had never dreamed of doing, was just a difficult phase, the kind of thing everyone goes through at some time or another. During Di's difficult phase, she frequented the Copacabana, went with men for money, played the innocent girl, the femme fatale and the understanding mother, depending on the client. But it was just a job, which she did with total professionalism, for the sake of the tips, and minimum interest, for fear she might get used to it. She had spent the last 9 months controlling the world around her, and shortly before she was due to go back to her own country, she was finding that she was capable of loving without demanding anything in return and of suffering for no reason. It was as if life had chosen this strange, sordid way of teaching her something about her own mysteries, her light, and her darkness. From Maria's diary on the night following her first meeting with Terence, he quoted the Marquis de Sade, of whom I know nothing, apart from the word sadism. It's true that we only know each other when we come up against our 0mrn limits, but it's wrong too, because it isn't necessary to know everything about ourselves. Human weren't made solely to go in search of wisdom, but also to plow the land, wait for rain, plant the wheat, harvest the grain, make the bread. I am 2 women, one wants to have all the joy, passion, and adventure that life can give me. The other wants to be a slave to routine, to family life, to things that can be planned and achieved. I'm a housewife and a prostitute, of us living in the same body and doing battle with each other. The meeting of these 50 women is a game with serious risks. A divine dance. When we meet, we are 2 divine energies, 2 universes colliding. If the meeting is not carried out with due reverence, one universe destroys the other. She was back in Ralph Hart's living room, With the fire, the bottle of wine, the two of them sitting on the floor, and everything she had experienced the previous night with the English executive just a dream or a nightmare depending on how she was feeling. Now she was searching once more for her reason for living, or, rather, for the kind of utter surrender by which a person offers his or her heart and asks for nothing in return. She had grown a lot while waiting for this moment. She had finally discovered that real love has nothing to do with what she imagined, that is, with a chain of events provoked by the energy engendered by love, courtship, engagement, marriage, children, waiting, cooking, the amusement park on Sundays, more waiting, getting old together, an end to the waiting, and then, in its place, comes your husband's retirement, illnesses, the feeling that it is far too late to live out your dream together. She looked at the man to whom she had decided to give herself, and to whom she had resolved never to reveal her feelings, because what she was feeling now was far from taking any definite form, not even physical form. He seemed more at ease, as if he were embarking on an interesting period of his life. He was smiling and telling her about his recent visit to Munich to meet an important museum director. He asked if the painting about the faces of Geneva was ready yet. I said I had just met one of the principal people I would like to paint, a woman who was full of light. But I don't want to talk about me, I want to embrace you. I desire you. Desire. Desire? Desire. That was the point of departure this evening, because it was something she knew extremely well. For example, you awaken desire by not immediately handing over the object of that desire. All right, then, desire me. That's what we're doing right now. You are less than a yard away from me, you went to a nightclub, paid for my services, and you know you have the right to touch me. But you don't dare. Look at me. Look at me and imagine that perhaps I don't want you to look at me. Imagine what's hidden beneath my clothes. She always wore black to work, and she couldn't understand why the other girls at the Copacabana tried to look provocative in their low-cut dresses and garish colors. It seemed to her that it was more exciting for a man if she dressed like any other woman he might meet at the office, on the train or in the house of one of his wife's friends. Ralph looked at her. Maria felt him undressing her and she enjoyed being desired like that, with no contact, as if she were in a restaurant or standing in a queue at the cinema. We're in a train station, Maria went on. I'm standing next to you, waiting for a train, but you don't know me. My eyes meet yours, by chance, and I don't look away. You don't know what I'm trying to say, because, although you're an intelligent man, capable of seeing the legal in other people, you are not sensitive enough to see what that light is illuminating. She had learned about theater. She had wanted to forget the face of that English executive as quickly as possible, but there he was, guiding her imagination. My eyes are fixed on yours, and I might be wondering to myself, do I know him from somewhere? Or I might just distracted. Or I might be afraid of appearing unfriendly, perhaps you do know me, and so I give you the benefit of the doubt for a few seconds, until it becomes clear either that you really do know me or that it's a case of mistaken identity. But I might also be wanting the simplest thing in the world, to find a man. I might be trying to escape an unhappy love affair. I might be hoping to avenge myself for a recent betrayal and have gone to the train station looking for a stranger. I might want to be your prostitute just for one night, to do something different in my otherwise boring life. I might even be a real prostitute on the lookout for work. A brief silence, Maria had grown distracted. She was back in that hotel room, remembering the humiliation, yellow, red, pain and a great deal of pleasure. That encounter had burned her soul in a way she did not like at all. Ralph noticed and tried to take her back to the train station. In Di's meeting, do you desire me too? I don't know. We don't talk. You don't know. She grows distracted again. The theater idea is proving really very helpful. It draws out the real person and drives away the many false people who live inside us. The fact is that I don't look away, and you don't know what to do. Should you approach? Will you be rejected? Will I call the guard? Or invite you for a coffee perhaps? I'm on my way back from Munich, Ralph Hart said, and his voice sounds different, as if they really were meeting for the first time. I'm thinking about a collection of paintings on the many personalities of sex, the many masks that people wear in order never to experience a real encounter. He knew about the theater. Milan had said that he too was a special client. An alarm bell rang, but she needed time to think. The director of the museum said to me, "What are you going to base your work on?" I said, "On women who feel free enough to earn their living making love." He said, "That won't work, we call such women prostitutes." I said, "Fine, they are prostitutes, I'm going to study their history and create something more intellectual, more to the taste of the families who visit your museum. It's all a question of culture, you see. Of finding a palatable way of presenting something that is otherwise very hard to take." The director insisted, "But sex is no longer a taboo. It's been so overexploited that it's difficult to produce any new work on the subject." I said, "Do you know where sexual desire comes from?" "From our instinct," said the director. "Yes," I said, "from our instinct, but everyone knows that. How can you make a beautiful exhibition if all we are talking about is science? I want to talk about how man explains that attraction, the way, let's say, a philosopher would explain it." The director asked me to give him an example. I said that if, when I caught the train back home, a woman looked at me, I would go over and speak to her. I would say that, since we were strangers, we had the freedom to do anything we wanted, to live out all our fantasies, and then go home to our wife or husband and never meet again. And then, in the train station, I see you. Your story is so interesting it's in danger of killing desire." Ralph Hart laughed and agreed. They had finished one bottle of wine and he went into the kitchen to fetch another, and she sat staring into the fire, knowing what the next step would be, but, at the same time, savoring the cozy atmosphere, forgetting about the English executive, and regaining that sense of surrender. Ralph filled their 2 glasses, and Maria said, "Just out of curiosity, how would you end that story with the museum director?" "Since I was in the company of an intellectual, I would quote from Plato. According to him, at the of creation, men and women were not as they are now. There was just one being, who was rather short, with a body and a neck, but his head had 2 faces, looking in different directions. It was as if 2 creatures had been glued back to back, with 2 sets of sex organs, 4 legs and 4 arms. The Greek gods, however, were jealous, because this creature with 4 arms could work harder. With its 2 faces, it was always vigilant and could not be taken by surprise, and its 4 legs meant that it could stand or walk for long periods at a time without tiring. Even more dangerous was the fact that the creature had 2 different sets of sex organs and so needed no one else in order to continue reproducing. Zeus, the supreme lord of Olympus, said, "I have a plan to make these mortals lose some of their strength." And he cut the creature in 2 with a lightning bolt, thus creating man and woman. This greatly increased the population of the world, and, at the same time, disoriented and weakened its inhabitants. Now they had to search for their lost half and embrace it and, in that embrace, regain their former strength, their ability to avoid betrayal and the stamina to walk for long periods of time and to withstand hard work. That embrace in which the 2 bodies refuse to become one again is what we call sex. Is that a true story? According to the Greek philosopher, Plato, yes. Maria was gazing at him, fascinated, and the experience of the previous night had vanished completely. She saw that the man before her was full of the same light that he had seen in her, entirely involved in telling her that strange story, his eyes alight now not with desire but with joy. "Can I ask you a favor?" Ralph said she could ask anything she wanted. "Is it possible to know why, after the gods had split the 4-legged creature in 2, some of them decided that the embrace could be merely a thing, just another business transaction, which instead of increasing people's energy, diminished it?" "You mean prostitution?" "Yes. Could you find out if, in the beginning, sex was something sacred?" "If you like," replied Ralph, "although it's not something I've ever thought about, nor, as far as I know, has anyone else. Perhaps there isn't any literature on the subject." Maria could stand the pressure no longer. Has it ever occurred to you that women, in particular, prostitutes, are capable of love? Yes, it has. It occurred to me on that first day, when we were sitting in the cafe and I saw your light. Then, when I decided to offer you a cup of coffee, I chose to in everything, even in the possibility of you returning me to the world I left a long, long time ago. There was no going back now. Maria, the teacher, needed to rush to her own aid, otherwise she would kiss him, embrace him, and ask him never to leave her. Let's go back to the train station, she said. Or, rather, let's come back to this room, to the day when we sat here together for the first time and you recognized that I existed and gave me a gift. That was your first attempt to enter my soul, and you weren't sure whether or not you were welcome. But, as you say in your story, human beings were once divided and now seek the embrace that will reunite them. That is our instinct. But it is also our reason for putting up with all the difficulties we meet in that search. I want you to look at me, but I want you to take care that I don't notice. Initial desire is important because it is hidden, forbidden, not permitted. You don't know whether you are looking at your lost half or not, she doesn't know either, but something is drawing you together, and you must believe that it is true you are each other's other half. Where am I getting all this? I'm drawing it up from the bottom of my heart, because this is how I always wanted it to be. I'm drawing up these dreams from my own dream as a woman. She slipped off the shoulder strap of her dress, so that one tiny part of one nipple was exposed. Desire is not what you see, but what you imagine. Ralph Hart was looking at a woman with dark hair and wearing dark clothes, who was sitting on the floor of his living room, and was full of absurd desires, like having an open fire burning in the middle of summer. Yes, he would like to imagine what those clothes were hiding. He could guess the size of her breasts, and he knew that she didn't really need the bra she was wearing, although perhaps she had to wear it for her work. Her breasts were neither large nor small, they were simply young. Her eyes gave nothing away. What was she doing here? Why was he encouraging this absurd, dangerous relationship, when he had no problems finding women? He was rich, young, famous, good-looking. He loved his work, he had loved women whom he had subsequently married, he had been loved. He was someone who, according to all the rules and norms, should have been able to shout out loud, "I'm happy," but he wasn't. While most of humanity was scrabbling for a piece of bread, a roof over their head and a job that would allow them to live with dignity, Ralph Hart had all of that, and it only made him feel more if he looked back on what his life had been lately. He had perhaps managed 5 or 3 days when he had woken up, looked at the sun, or the rain, and felt glad to see the morning, just happy, without wanting anything, planning anything, or asking anything in exchange. Apart from those few days, the rest of his existence had been wasted on dreams, both frustrated and realized a desire to go himself, to go beyond his limitations. He had spent his life trying to prove something, but he didn't know what or to whom. He looked at the beautiful woman before him, who was discreetly dressed in black, someone he had met by chance, although he had seen her before at the nightclub and thought that she seemed out of place. She had asked him to desire her, and he desired her intensely, far more than she could imagine, but it wasn't her breasts or her body, it was her company he desired. He wanted to put his arms around her and to sit in silence, staring into the fire, drinking wine, smoking the occasional cigarette. That would be enough. Life was made up of simple things. He was weary of all the years he had spent searching for something, though quite what he didn't know. And yet, if he did that, if he touched her, all would be lost. For, despite the light he could see in Maria, he wasn't sure she realized how good it was for him to be by her side. Was he paying? Yes, and he would continue paying for as long as it took to win her, to sit with her by the lakeside and speak of love, and to hear her say the same thing. It was best not to take any chances, not to rush things, not to say anything. Ralph Hart stopped tormenting himself and concentrated once more on the game they had just created together. The woman before him was right. The wine, the fire, the cigarettes, and the company were not enough in themselves. Another kind of intoxication, Another kind of flame was required. She was wearing a dress with shoulder straps, she was revealing one breast, he could see her skin, more dark than pale. He desired her. He desired her intensely. Maria noticed the change in Ralph's eyes. Knowing that she was desired excited her more than anything else. It had nothing to do with the automatic formula, I want to make love with you, I want to get married, I want you to have an orgasm, I want you to have my child, I want commitment. No, desire was an entirely free sensation, loose in the air, vibrating, filling life with the will to have something, and that was enough. That will carried all before it, moved mountains, made her wet. Desire was the source of everything else, leaving her country, discovering a new world, learning French, overcoming her prejudices, dreaming of having a farm, loving without asking for anything in return, feeling that she was a woman simply because a man was looking at her. With calculated slowness, she slipped off the other strap, and the dress slid down her body. Then she undid her bra. There she was, with the upper part of her body completely bare, wondering if he would leap on her, touch her, utter vows of love, or if he was sensitive enough simply to feel sexual pleasure and desire itself. Things around them began to change, all sound disappeared, the fire, the paintings and the books gradually vanished, to be replaced by a kind of trance-like state, in which only the object of desire exists, and nothing else is important. The man did not move. At first, she felt a certain shyness in his eyes, but that did not last long. He was looking at her, and in the world of his imagination, he was caressing her with his tongue. They were making love, sweating, clinging to each other, mingling tenderness and violence, calling out and moaning together. In the real world, though, they said nothing, neither of them moved, and that made her even more excited, because she too was free to think what she liked. She was asking him to touch her gently, she was opening her legs, she was masturbating in front of him, saying the most romantic things and the lewdest things, as if they were one and the same. She had several orgasms, waking the neighbors, waking the whole world with her cries. Here was her man, who was giving her pleasure and joy, with whom she could be the person she really was, with whom she could talk about her sexual problems, and tell him how much she would like to stay with him for the rest of the night, for the rest of the week, for the rest of her life. Beads of sweat began to appear on their foreheads. It was the heat from the fire, one said mentally to the other. But both the man and the woman in that room had reached their limit, exhausted their imagination, experienced together an eternity of good moments. They needed to stop, because if they took one more step, the magic would be undone by reality. Very slowly, because endings are always more difficult than beginnings, she put on her bra and hid her breasts. The universe returned to its normal place, the things around them re-emerged. She pulled up the dress that had fallen about her waist, smiled and very gently touched his face. He took her hand and pressed it to his cheek, not knowing for how long he should hold it there, or how tightly. She wanted to tell him that she loved him. But that would spoil everything, it might frighten him or, worse, might make him say that he loved her too. Maria didn't want that. The freedom of her love depended on asking nothing and expecting nothing. Anyone capable of feeling knows that it is possible to experience pleasure before even touching the other person. The words, the looks, all contain the secret of the dance. But the train has arrived, we each go our separate ways. I hope to be able to join you on this journey to where? Back to Geneva, replied Ralph. Anyone who is observant, who discovers the person they have always dreamed of, knows that sexual energy comes into play before sex even takes place. The greatest pleasure isn't sex, but the passion with which it is practiced. When the passion is intense, then sex joins in to complete the dance, but it is never the principal aim. You're talking love like a teacher. Maria went on talking, because this was her defense, her way of saying everything without committing herself to anything. Anyone who is in love is making love the whole time, even when they're not. When two bodies meet, it is just the cup overflowing. They can stay together for hours, even days. They begin the dance one day and finish it the next, or such is the pleasure they experience, they may never finish it. No 11 minutes for them. What? I love you. I love you too. I'm sorry, I don't know what I'm saying. Nor do I. She got up, kissed him and left. This time she opened the front door herself, since, according to the Brazilian superstition, the owner of the house only has to open the door on the first occasion that a guest leaves. From Maria's diary, written the next morning, last night, when Ralph Hart looked at me, he opened a door, as if he were a thief, but when he left, he took nothing from me. On the contrary, he left behind him the scent of roses. He wasn't a thief, he was a bridegroom visiting me. Every human being experiences his or her own desire, it is part of our personal treasure and, although, as an emotion, it can drive people away, generally speaking, it brings those who are important to us closer. It is an emotion chosen by my soul, and it is so intense that it can infect everything and everyone around me. Each day I choose the truth by which I try to live. I try to be practical, efficient, professional. But I would like to be able always to choose desire as my companion. Not out of obligation, not to lessen my loneliness, but because it is good. Yes, very good. On average, 38 women worked at the Copacabana on a regular basis, but only one of them, the Filipino, Naya, was what Maria would consider a friend. Women stayed there an average of 6 months minimum and 3 years maximum, because they would either get a proposal of marriage, be set up as a mistress, or no longer pull in the clients, in which case, Milan would delicately ask them to find somewhere else to work. That is why it was important to respect each other's clientele and never try to seduce men who always headed for a particular girl as soon as they came in. Apart from being dishonest, it could also be very dangerous. The previous week, a Colombian woman had quietly taken a cutthroat razor out of her pocket, placed it on the glass being used by one of the Yugoslav girls, and said, in the calmest of voices, that she would mark her face if she persisted in giving in to the advances of a certain bank manager who was a regular customer. The Yugoslav said that the man was a free agent and that, if he chose her, she couldn't really say no. That night, the man came in, greeted the Colombian woman, but went over to the Yugoslav's table. They had a drink, danced, and the Yugoslav winked at the Colombian, a provocation too far in Maria's view, as if saying, "See? He chose me." But that wink contained many unspoken things. He chose me because I'm prettier, because I went with him last week and he enjoyed it, because I'm young. The Colombian said nothing. When the Yugoslav came back, 2 hours later, the Colombian sat down beside her, took the razor out of her pocket and made a cut on the Yugoslav's face, near her ear. It wasn't a deep cut, and it wasn't dangerous, but it was enough to leave a small scar to remind her of that night. The two started writing, blood spurted everywhere and the frightened customers fled. When the police arrived, wanting to know what was going on, the Yugoslav said that she had cut her face on a glass that had fallen from a shelf. There are no shelves in the Copacabana. This was the law of silence, or what Italian prostitutes like to call omerta. Any problem to be resolved in Rue de Berne, from love to death, would be resolved, but without the interference of the law. They made their own laws there. The police knew about the omerta and could see that the woman was lying, but they didn't insist. Arresting someone, trying them, and then keeping them in prison would cost the Swiss taxpayer far too much money. Milan thanked the police for their prompt response, but, he said, it was all a misunderstanding or else a rival nightclub owner trying to make trouble. As soon as they left, he asked the two women not to come back to his club. After all, the Copacabana was a family place, a statement Maria found hard to grasp, and had a reputation to keep up. This left her still more intrigued. There were no fights there, because the first law was to respect another woman's client. The second law was total discretion, just like a Swiss bank, he said. This was largely because, there, the women could trust the clients, who were selected much as a bank selects its clients, based on the state of their current account and on personal references. Mistakes were occasionally made. There were a few rare cases of non-payment, of girls being threatened or roughed up, but in the many years he had spent struggling to create and develop his club's reputation, Milan had become an expert at recognizing who should or shouldn't be invited in. None of the women knew exactly what these criteria were, but they had often seen some well-dressed man being told that the club was full that night, even though it was empty, and that it would be full the following nights too. Please don't come back. They had also seen unshaven men dressed in casual clothes being enthusiastically invited by Milan to a glass of champagne. The owner of the Copacabana did not judge by appearances, and he was always right. It was a good working relationship, and seemed to suit parties involved. The great majority of the clientele were married, or held important positions in some company or power. Some of the women who worked there were also married and had children and went to parents' evenings at their children's schools, but knew that they ran no risk of being exposed. If one of the other parents turned up at the Copacabana, they would be compromised too and so could say nothing. That is how Omerta worked. There was comradeship amongst the women, but not friendship. No one talked much about their lives. In the few conversations she had had, Maria found no bitterness, guilt, or sadness amongst her colleagues, only a kind of resignation, and a strangely defiant glint in the eye, as if they were proud of the way they confronted the world, independently and confidently. After a week, any new arrival was considered a fellow professional and received instructions always to help keep marriages intact. A prostitute cannot be seen as a threat to the stability of the home. Never to accept invitations to meet outside working hours, to listen to confessions without offering an opinion, to moan at the moment of climax. Maria learned that everyone did this, but that they hadn't told her on her very first day because it was one of the tricks of the trade, to say hello to the police in the street, to keep her work permit up to date as well as any health checks, and, finally, not to probe too deeply into the moral or legal aspects of what she was doing. They were what they were, and that was that. Before it got busy, Maria could always be seen with a book in her hand, and she soon known as the intellectual of the group. At first, they wanted to know if she was reading a love story, but when they saw that the books were about dry-as-dust subjects like economics, psychology and, recently, farm management, they left her alone to continue her researches and her note-taking piece. Because she had a lot of regular clients and because she went to the Copacabana every night, even when it wasn't busy, Maria earned both Milan's confidence and her colleagues' envy. They said she was ambitious, arrogant, and thought only about earning money. The last bit was true, but she felt like asking if they weren't all there for the very same reason. Anyway, remarks like that never killed anyone. They were part of the life of any successful person, and it was best to get used to them, rather than let herself be diverted from her two goals, going back to Brazil on the chosen date and buying a farm. Ralph's heart was in her thoughts from morning to night now, and for the first time she was able to feel happy with an absent love, although she slightly regretted having confessed her love, thus running the risk of losing everything. But what had she got to lose, if she was asking for nothing in exchange? She remembered how her heart had beat faster when Milan mentioned that Ralph was, or had been, a special client. That did that mean? She felt betrayed and jealous. It was normal to feel jealous, although life had taught her that it was pointless thinking you could own another person. Anyone who believes that is just deceiving themselves. Despite this, she could not stop herself having these feelings of jealousy, or of having grand intellectual thoughts about it, or even thinking it was a proof of fragility. The strongest love is the love that can demonstrate its fragility. Anyway, if my love is real, and not just a way of distracting myself, deceiving myself, and passing the time, that never seems to pass in Di's city, freedom will conquer jealousy and any pain it causes me, since pain is also part of the natural process. Anyone who practices sport knows this. If you want to achieve your objectives, you have to be prepared for a daily dose of pain or discomfort. At first, it's unpleasant and demotivating, but in time you come to realize that it's part of the process of feeling good, and the moment arrives when, if you don't feel pain, you have a sense that the exercises aren't having the desired effect. The danger lies in focusing on that pain, giving it a particular person's name, and keeping it always present in your thoughts. Maria, thank God, had managed to free herself from that. Even so, she sometimes found herself wondering where he was, why he didn't he come and see her, if he had found that whole story about the train station and repressed desire stupid, if he had gone away forever because she had confessed her love for him. To avoid beautiful thoughts turning into suffering, she developed a method. When something positive to do with Ralph's heart came into her head, and this could be the fire and the wine, an idea she would like to discuss with him, or simply the pleasurable longing involved in wanting to know when he would come back, Maria would stop what she was doing, smile up at the sky and give thanks for alive and to be expecting nothing from the man she loved. On the other hand, if her heart began to complain about his absence or things she shouldn't have said while they were together, she would say to herself, "Oh, so you want to think about that, do you? All right, then, you do what you like, while I get on with more important things." She would continue to read or, if she was out, she would focus her attention on everything around her, colors, people, sounds, especially sounds, the sound of her own footsteps, of the pages turning, of cars, of fragments of conversations, and the unfortunate thought would eventually go away. If it came back 5 minutes later, she would repeat the process, until those thoughts, finding themselves accepted but also gently rejected, would stay away for quite considerable periods of time. One of these negative thoughts was the possibility of never seeing him again. With a little practice and a great deal of patience, she managed to transform this into a positive thought. When she left, Geneva would have the face of a man with old-fashioned long hair, a childlike smile and a grave voice. If someone asked her, many years later, what the place she had known in her youth was like, she could reply, "Very beautiful, and capable of loving and being loved." From Maria's diary, on a slack night at the Copacabana, after all the time RVE spent with the people who come here, I have reached the conclusion that sex has come to be used as some kind of drug, in order to escape reality, to forget about problems, to relax. And like all drugs, this is a harmful and destructive practice. If a person wants to take drugs, in the form of sex or whatever, that's their problem. The consequences of their actions will be better or worse depending on the choices they make. But if we are talking in terms of making progress in life, we must understand that good enough is very different from best. Contrary to what my clients think, sex cannot be practiced at any time. We all have a clock inside us, and in order to make love, the hands on both clocks have to be pointing to the same hour at the same time. That doesn't happen every day. If you love another person, you don't depend on the sex act in order to feel good. Two people who live together and love each other need to adjust the hands of their clocks, with patience and perseverance, games, and theatrical representations, until they realize that making love is more than just an encounter, it is a genital embrace. Everything is important. If you live your life intensely, you experience pleasure all the time and don't feel the need for sex. When you have sex, it's out of a sense of abundance, because the glass of wine is so full that it overflows naturally, because it is inevitable, because you are responding to the call of life, because at that moment, and only at that moment, you have allowed yourself to lose control. P.S. I have just reread what I wrote. Good grief. I'm getting way too intellectual. Shortly after writing Dies, and when she was preparing for another night as understanding mother or innocent girl, the door of the Copacabana opened and in walked Terence, the record company executive, one of the special clients. Behind the bar, Milan seemed pleased. Maria had not disappointed him. Maria remembered the words that simultaneously said so much and so little: pain, suffering, and a great deal of pleasure. I flew in from London especially to see you. RVE been thinking about you a lot. She smiled, trying not to look too encouraging. Again he had failed to follow the ritual and hadn't asked if she wanted a drink, but just sat down at her table. When a teacher helps someone to discover something, the teacher always learns something new too. I know what you mean, said Maria, Diane King of Ralph Ward and feeling irritated with herself for doing so. She was with another client, and she must respect him and do what she could to please him. Do you want to go ahead? 1,000 francs. A hidden universe. Her boss watched her. The certainty that she could stop whenever she chose. The date set for her return to Brazil. The other man, who never came to see her. "Are you in a hurry?" Maria asked. He said no. What was it she wanted? "I'd like my usual drink and my usual dance, and some respect for my profession." He hesitated for a moment, but it was all part of the theater, dominating and being dominated. He her a drink and danced with her, then ordered a taxi and gave her the money while they drove across the city to the same hotel. They went in, he greeted the Italian porter just as he had on the night they first met, and they went up to the same suite with a view over the river. Terence got up and took out his lighter, and only then did Maria notice that there were dozens of candles arranged around the room. He started lighting them. "What would you like to know? Why I'm like this? Because, unless I'm very much mistaken, you really enjoyed the other evening we spent together. Do you want to know why you're like this too? I was just thinking that in Brazil we have a superstition that you should never light more than 3 things with the same match. You're not respecting that superstition." He ignored her remark. "You're like me. You're not here for the 1,000 francs, but out of a sense of guilt and dependency, because of your various complexes and insecurities. That is neither good nor bad, it's simply human nature." He picked up the remote control and changed channels several times until he found the TV news and a report on refugees trying to escape a war. "Do you see that? Have you ever seen those programs in which people discuss their personal problems in front of everyone? Have you been to a newspaper kiosk and seen the headlines? The world enjoys suffering and pain. There's sadism in the way we look at these things, and masochism in our conclusion that we don't need to know all this in order to be happy, and yet we watch other people's tragedies and sometimes suffer along with them." He poured out 2 glasses of champagne, turned off the television and continued lighting candles, in contravention of the superstition Maria had mentioned. "As I say, it's the human condition. Ever since we were expelled from paradise, we have either been suffering, making other people suffer, or watching the suffering of others. It's beyond our control." From outside came the sound of thunder and lightning. A huge storm was approaching. "But I can't do it," Maria said. "It seems ridiculous to me pretending that you're my master and I'm your slave. We don't need theater to find suffering, life offers us more than enough opportunities." Terence had just finished lighting the candles. He picked one up and placed it in the middle of the table, then served the champagne and caviar. Maria washed drinking quickly, thinking about the 1,000 francs in her bag, about this stranger who both fascinated and frightened her, and about how she could control her fear. She knew that, with this man, no night would ever be the same as another. She could not intimidate him in any way. "Sit down." His voice alternated between being gentle and authoritarian. Maria obeyed, and a wave of heat swept up her body. That order was familiar, she felt more secure. "It's theater. I've got to get involved in the play." It was nice being ordered around. She didn't have to think, just obey. She asked for more champagne, and he brought vodka. It went to one's head more quickly, loosened one up, and went better with the caviar. He opened the bottle. Maria was more or less drinking alone, while she listened to the thunder and lightning outside. Everything was conspiring to make the moment perfect, as if the energies of the skies and the earth were also showing their violent side. After a while, Terence took a small suitcase out of the wardrobe and placed it on the bed. "Don't move." Maria sat motionless. He opened the suitcase and took out 2 pairs of chrome metal handcuffs. "Sit with your legs apart." She obeyed, impotent out of choice, submissive because she wanted to be. She saw him looking between her legs. He could see her black pants, her long stockings, her thighs. He could imagine her pubic hair, her sex. "Stand up." She leaped up from her chair. She found it hard to stand straight and realized that she was drunker than she thought. "Don't look at me. Lower your head, respect your master." Before she could lower her head, she saw a slender whip being removed from the suitcase, then cracking through the air, as if it had a life of its own. "Drink. Keep your head down, but drink." She drank another one, Envo, 3 glasses of vodka. This wasn't just theater now, it was reality. Control was out of her hands. She felt like an object, a mere instrument, and incredible though it may seem, that feeling of submission gave her a sense of complete freedom. She was no longer the teacher, the one who instructs, consoles, listens to confessions, the one who excites. Before the awesome power of this man, she was just a girl from the interior of Brazil. "Take off your clothes." The order was delivered abruptly, without a flicker of desire, and yet, nothing could have been more erotic. Keeping her head down as a sign of reverence, Maria unbuttoned her dress and let it slip to the floor. "You're not behaving yourself, you know." Again the whip cracked through the air. "You need to be punished. How dare a girl your age contradict me? You should be on your knees before me." Maria made as if to kneel down, but the whip brought her up short. For the first time it touched her flesh, her buttocks. It stung, but seemed to leave no mark. "Did I tell you to kneel, DMVN? No." The whip again flicked across her buttocks. "Say, no, sir." Another stinging whiplash. For a fraction of a second, it occurred to her that she could either stop this right now or else choose to go tyro with it, not for the money, but because of what he had said the first time, that you only know yourself when you go beyond your limits. And this was new, it was an adventure, and she could decide later on if she wanted to continue, but at that moment, she had ceased to be the girl with just 3 aims in life, who earned her living with her body, who had met a man who had an open fire and interesting stories to tell. Here, she was no one, and being no one meant that she could be everything she had ever dreamed of. "Take the rest of your clothes off. And walk up and down so that I can see you." Once more she obeyed, keeping her head down, saying not a word. The man who was watching her, still fully dressed and utterly impassive, was not the same person who had chatted to her on their way here from the club. He was a Ulysses who had traveled from London, a Theseus come D0MN from the heavens, a kidnapper invading the safest city in the world, and who had the coldest heart on earth. She removed her pants and her bra, feeling at once defenseless and protected. The whip cracked again, this time without touching her body. "Keep your head down. You're here to be humiliated, to submit to my every desire, do you understand?" "Yes, sir." He grabbed her arms and put the first pair of handcuffs on her wrists. "You're going to get a good beating. Until you learn to behave yourself." He slapped her bottom with the flat of his hand. Maria cried out, this time it hurt. "Oh, so you're complaining, are you? Well, I haven't even started yet." Before she could do anything, he had placed a leather gag on her mouth. It didn't stop her speaking, she could still say yellow or red, but she felt now that it was her destiny to allow this man to do whatever he wished with her, and there was no way she could escape now. She was naked, gagged and handcuffed, with vodka flowing in her veins rather than blood. Another slap on her buttocks. "Walk up and down." Maria started to walk, obeying his commands. "Stop, turn to the right, sit down, open your legs." He slapped her again and again, whether she deserved it or not, and she felt the pain and felt the humiliation, which was more intense and more potent than the pain, and she felt as if she were in another world, in which nothing existed, and it was an almost religious feeling, self-annihilation, subjective, and a complete loss of any sense of ego, desire or selfless. She was very wet and very aroused, but unable to understand what was going on. "Down on your knees again." Since she always kept her head down, as a sign of obedience and humiliation, Maria could not see exactly what was happening, but she noticed that in that other universe, on that other planet, the man was breathing hard, worn out with wielding the whip and spanking her hard on the buttocks, whilst she felt herself filling up with strength and energy. She had lost all shame now, and wasn't bothered about showing her pleasure. She started to moan, pleading with him to touch her, but, instead, the man grabbed her and threw her onto the bed. He violently forced her legs apart, although she knew this violence would not actually harm her, and tied each leg to one corner of the bed. Now that her wrists were handcuffed behind her, her legs splayed, her mouth gagged, when would he penetrate her? Couldn't he see that she was ready, that she wanted to serve him, that she was his slave, his creature, his object, and would do anything he ordered her to do. 11 minutes, would you like me to take you further still? She saw him place the end of the whip handle against her vagina. He rubbed it up and down, and when it touched her clitoris, she lost all control. She had no idea how long they had been there nor how many times she had been spanked, but suddenly she came and had the orgasm which, in all those months, dozens, no, hundreds of men had failed to give her. There was a burst of light. She felt herself entering a kind of black hole in her soul, in which intense pain and fear mingled with total pleasure, pushing her beyond all previously known limits, and she moaned and screamed, her voice muffled by the gag. She writhed on the bed, feeling the handcuffs cutting into her emptists and the leather thongs bruising her ankles. She moved as never before precisely because she could not move. She screamed as never before because she had a gag on her mouth and no one would be able to hear her. This was pain and pleasure, the end of the whip handle pressing ever harder against her clitoris and the orgasm flooding out of her mouth, her vagina, her pores, her eyes, her skin. She entered a kind of trance, and slowly, very slowly, she began to come down. There was no whip pressing between her legs now, just sweat-drenched hair, kind hands removing the handcuffs, untying the leather thongs around her ankles. She lay there, confused, unable to look at the man because she was ashamed of herself, of her screams, of her orgasm. He was stroking her hair and he too was breathing hard, but the pleasure had been entirely hers. He had not enjoyed a single moment of ecstasy. Her naked body embraced that of Di's fully clothed man, who was exhausted from shouting orders and keeping tight control of the situation. She didn't know what to say, now to continue, but she felt safe and protected, because he had invited her to go to a place inside herself that she had never known before. He was her protector and her master. She started to cry, and he waited patiently until she had finished. "What did you do to me?" she asked tearfully. "What you wanted me to do." She looked at him, feeling that she needed him desperately. "I didn't force you or oblige you to do anything, nor did I hear you say yellow. I had only the power you gave me. There was no obligation, no blackmail on my part, only your will. You may have been the slave and I the master, but my only power was to push you in the direction of your own freedom." Handcuffs. Leather thongs around her ankles. A gag. Humiliation that was more intense and more potent than any pain. And yet, he was quite right, the feeling was one of total freedom. Maria felt full of energy and vigor and was surprised to see that the man beside her was utterly exhausted. "Did you come?" "No," he said. "The master is here to drive the slave on. The pleasure of the slave is the joy of the master." None of this made sense. It wasn't the way it was in stories, it wasn't the way it was in real life. But here in this fantasy world, she was full of light, while he seemed opaque, drained. "You can leave whenever you want," Terence said. "I don't want to leave, I want to understand." "There's nothing to understand." She got up in all the beauty and intensity of her nakedness and poured 2 glasses of wine. She lit 2 cigarettes and gave him one of them. The roles were reversed. She was now the mistress serving the slave, rewarding him for the pleasure he had given her. "I'll get dressed and then I'll leave, but, first, I'd like to talk a little." "There's nothing to talk about. That's all I wanted, and you were marvelous. I'm tired now and I have to go back to London tomorrow." He lay down and closed his eyes. Maria didn't know if he was just pretending to sleep, and she didn't care. She smoked a leisurely cigarette and slowly sipped her wine, with her face pressed against the window pane, looking out at the lake opposite and wishing that someone, on the other shore, could see her like Di's, naked, replete, satisfied, confident. She got dressed and left without saying goodbye, and was not bothered whether she opened the door or he did, because she wasn't sure that she wanted to come back. Terence heard the door close, waited to see if she would come back, saying that she had forgotten something, and only after a few minutes did he get up and light another cigarette. The girl had style, he thought. She had withstood the whip well, although this was the oldest, the most common and the least severe of the punishments. For a moment, He sat remembering the first time he had experienced that mysterious relationship between two beings who want to be close, but can only be so by inflicting suffering. Millions of couples out there practiced the art of sadomasochism every day, without even realizing it. They went to work, came back, complained about everything, insulted their wife or were insulted by her, felt wretched, but were, nonetheless, tightly bound to their own unhappiness, not realizing that all it would take was a single gesture, a final goodbye, to free them from that oppression. Terence had experienced this with his wife, a well-known English singer. He was tormented by jealousy, he made scenes, and spent whole days dosed up with painkillers, whole nights hopelessly drunk. She loved him and couldn't understand why he behaved like that, he loved her and couldn't understand his behavior. It was as if the agony that the one inflicted on the other was necessary, fundamental to life. One day, a musician, whom he had always thought of as very strange, because he seemed so normal in the midst of all those exotic people, left a book in the studio, Venus in Furs by Leopold von Sacher-Masoch. Terence started leafing through it and, as he read, he began to understand himself better. The lovely woman took off her clothes and picked up a long, short-handled whip. "You asked for it," she said, "so I'm going to whip you." "Oh, yes," murmured her lover, "please, I beg you." His wife was on the other side of the glass screen, rehearsing. She had asked them to turn off the microphones that allowed the technicians to listen into everything, and they had done so. Terence was thinking that perhaps she was making a date with the pianist, and he realized that she was driving him mad, but it was as if he was so accustomed to suffering now that he could not live without it. "I'm going to whip you," said the naked woman in the book he was reading. "Oh, yes, please, I beg you." He was a good-looking man, and a force to be reckoned with in the record company. Why did he need to lead such a life? Because he wanted to. He deserved to suffer because life had been so good to him, and he wasn't worthy of all these blessings, money, respect, fame. He felt that his career was leading him to a point where he would become dependent on success, and that frightened him, because he had seen a lot of people plummet from the heights. He read the book. He started reading everything he could find about the mysterious union between pain and pleasure. His wife found the videos he was renting and the books he was hiding from her, and asked him what it was all about. Was he sick? Terence said no, it was just research he was doing for a new cover. Then he said nonchalantly, "Perhaps we should try it." They did. They began very timidly, using the manuals they found in porn shops. Gradually, they developed new techniques, took their activities to dangerous limits, and yet they felt that their marriage was even stronger. They were accomplices in something hidden, forbidden, proscribed. Their joint experience was transformed into art. They created new outfits, leather with metal studs. His wife went on stage wearing boots and a suspender belt and wielding a whip, and the audience went wild. Her new record shot to the top of the charts in England and went on triumph in the rest of Europe. Terence was surprised how young people accepted his personal fantasies as perfectly natural, and the only explanation he could find was that it provided a means of expressing repressed violence in an intense but inoffensive manner. The whip came to be the group's logo and was reproduced on t-shirts, fake tattoos, stickers and postcards. Terence's intellectual bent drove him to track down the origins of all this, so that he could understand himself better. These origins did not lie, as he had told Maria, with those penitents trying to drive away the Black Death. Ever since the Dark Ages, man has understood that suffering, if confronted without fear, is his passport to freedom. Egypt, Rome, and Persia all shared the notion that a man can save his country and his world by sacrificing himself. Whenever there was a great natural disaster in China, the emperor was punished, because he was the divinity's earthly representative. In ancient Greece, the finest Spartan warriors were whipped once a year, from morning till night, in homage to the goddess Artemis, while the crowd urged them on, calling on them to withstand the pain with dignity, for it was preparing them for the world of war. At the end of the day, the priests would examine the wounds on the warriors' backs and use them to predict the city's future. The priests of the desert, in an ancient, 4th century Christian community that grew up around a monastery in Alexandria, used flagellation as a way of driving out demons or of proving the futility of the body in the spiritual search. The history of saints was full of similar examples. Saint Rosa running through the garden, letting the thorns tear her skin, Saint Domingos Loricatus whipping himself every night before sleeping, the martyrs who voluntarily offered themselves up to a slow death on the cross or being torn apart by wild animals. They all said that pain, once mastered, could lead to religious ecstasy. Recent, unconfirmed studies indicated that a particular kind of fungus with hallucinogenic properties grew in the wounds and caused visions. The pleasure was so intense that the practice soon left the monasteries and convents and spread throughout the world. In 1718, a treatise on self-flagellation was published, which showed how to achieve pleasure through pain, but without harming the body. At the end of that century, there were dozens of places in Europe where people were prepared to suffer in order to attain joy. There are records of kings and princesses who had their slaves whip them, until they found that another kind of pleasure, albeit more exhausting and less gratifying, was to found not only in being whipped, but also in inflicting pain. While he was smoking his cigarette, Terence took a certain pleasurable pride in knowing that most people would be unable to understand what he was thinking. It was better to belong to an exclusive club to which the chosen had access. He remembered again how the sacrament of marriage had transformed into the miracle of marriage. His wife knew that he visited Geneva for this purpose and she didn't mind. On the contrary, in this sick world, she was glad that her husband got the reward he wanted after a hard week at work. The girl who had just left the room had understood everything. He felt that his soul was very close to hers, although he wasn't yet ready to fall in love, for he loved his wife. But he liked to think that he was free and could dream of a new relationship. All he had to do was to get her to attempt the next and most difficult stage, the transformation into Saccharmasocha's Venus in furs, the dominatrix, the mistress, capable of humiliating and punishing without pity. If she passed the test, he was ready to open his heart and let her in. From Maria's diary, when she was still drunk on vodka and pleasure, when I had nothing to lose, I had everything. When I stopped being who I am, I found myself. When I experienced humiliation and total submission, I was free. I don't know if it was all a dream, or if it only happens once. I know that I can perfectly well live without it, but I would like to do it again, to repeat the experience, to go still further. I was a bit frightened by the pain, but it wasn't as bad as the humiliation, and it was just a pretext. When I had my first orgasm in many months, despite all the many men I've been with and the many different things they've done with my body, I felt, is possible? Closer to God. I remembered what he said about how the flagellants, in offering up their pain for the salvation of humanity, found pleasure. I didn't want to save humanity, or him or me, I was just there. The art of sex is the art of controlled abandon. It wasn't theater this time, they were in a real train station, at Maria's request, because she liked the pizza you could buy there. There was nothing wrong with being a bit wayward sometimes. Ralph ought to have come to see her the day before, when she was still a woman in search of love, an open fire, wine, and desire. But life had chosen otherwise, and today she had got through the whole day without once having to make herself concentrate on the sounds around her or on the present moment, simply because she hadn't thought Ralph. She had discovered other more interesting things to think about. What was she to do with this man beside her, who was eating a pizza he probably didn't like and who was just passing the time until the moment came for them to go to his house? Then he had come into the club and offered her a drink. She had thought of telling him that she wasn't interested anymore and that he should find someone else. On the other hand, she had an enormous need to talk to S0 about the previous night. She had tried talking to one or two of the other prostitutes who served the special clients, but none of them tell her anything, because Maria was bright. She learned quickly and had become the great Tyrite in the Copacabana. Of all the men she knew, Ralph Hart was the only one who would understand, because Milan considered him too to be a special client. But he looked at her with eyes alight with love, and that made things difficult. it was best to say nothing. What do you know about pain, suffering and pleasure? She had once again failed to keep her thoughts to herself. Ralph stopped eating his pizza. Everything. And it doesn't interest me in the least. The reply had been instant, and Maria was shocked. Was she the only person in the world who didn't know everything? What kind of world was this? I've confronted my demons and my dark side, Ralph went on. Tive to the very depths and tried everything, not just in that area, but in many others too. On the last night we met, however, I went beyond my limits through desire, not pain. I plunged into the depths of my soul and I know that I still want good things, many good things from this life. He wanted to say, one of those good things is you, so, please, don't go down that path. But he didn't have the courage. Instead, he called a taxi and asked the driver to take them to the lake shore, where, an eternity before, they had walked together on the day they first met. Maria understood the request and said nothing. Her instinct told her that she had a lot to lose, although her mind was still drunk on what had happened the night before. She only awoke from her passive state when they reached the gardens beside the lake. Although it was still summer, it was already starting to get very cold at night. "What are we doing here?" she asked, as they got out of the taxi. "It's windy. I might catch a cold. I've been thinking about what you said at the train station, about suffering and pleasure. Take your shoes off." She remembered that once, one of her clients had asked the same thing, and had been aroused simply by looking at her feet. Would adventure never leave her in peace? "I'll catch a cold." "Do as I say," he insisted. "You won't catch a cold if we're quick. Believe in me, as I believe in you." For some reason, Maria realized that he was trying to help her, perhaps because he himself had once drunk of some very bitter water and was afraid that she was running the same risk. She didn't want to be helped. She was happy with her new world, in which she was learning that suffering wasn't a problem anymore. Then she thought of Brazil, of the impossibility of finding a partner with whom to share that different universe, and since Brazil was the most important thing in her life, she took off her shoes. The ground was covered in small stones that immediately tore her stockings, but that didn't matter, she could buy some more. "Take off your jacket." She could have said no, but, since last night, she had gotten used to the joy of saying yes to everything that came her way. She took off her jacket, and her body, still warm, took a while to react. Then gradually the cold began to get to her. "She can talk and walk at the same time." "I can't walk here, the ground's covered in stones." "Exactly. I want you to feel these stones, I want them to hurt you and bruise you, because, just as I did, you have started to associate suffering with pleasure, and I need to tear that out of your soul." Maria felt like saying, "There's no need, I like it." Instead, she began walking slowly along, and the soles of her feet began to burn with the cold and the sharp edges of the stones. "One of my exhibitions took me to Japan, just when I was immersed in what you called pain, suffering and pleasure. At the time, I thought there was no way back, that I would go deeper and deeper down, until there was nothing left in my life but the desire to punish and be punished. After all, we are human beings, we are born full of guilt, we feel terrified when happiness is a real possibility, and we die wanting to punish everyone else because we feel impotent, ill-used, and unhappy. To pay for one's sins and be able to punish the sinners, wouldn't that be delicious?" "Oh, yes, wonderful." Maria was still walking. The pain and the cold were making it hard for her to concentrate on what he was saying, but she was doing her best. "I noticed the marks on your today. The handcuffs." She had put on several bracelets to disguise the marks, but the expert eye knows what to look for. "Now, if your recent experiences are leading you to take that step, I won't stop you, but you should know that none of it has anything to do with real life." "Take what step?" "Into pain and pleasure, sadism and masochism. Call it what you like, but if you're sure that's the right path for you, I will be sad. I'll remember that feeling of desire, our meetings, our walk along the road to Santiago, your light. I will treasure the pen you gave me, and every time I light the fire, I will remember you. But I will never again come looking for you." Maria felt afraid. She felt it was time to recant, to tell him the truth, to stop pretending that she knew more than he did. What I experienced recently last night, in fact, was something I've never experienced before. And it frightens me to think that I could only find myself at the very limits of degradation. It was becoming difficult to speak, her teeth were chattering and her feet were really hurting. My exhibition was held in a region called Cumino, and one of the people who came to see it was a woodcutter, Ralph went on, as if he hadn't heard what she had said. He didn't like my pictures, but he was able to see, through the paintings, what I was experiencing and feeling. The following day, he came to my hotel and asked me if I was happy. If I was, I should continue doing what I liked. If I wasn't, I should go and spend a few days with him. He made me walk on stones, just as I am making you do today. He made me feel the cold. He forced me to understand the beauty of pain, except that the pain was imposed by nature, not by man. He called this shugendu, a very ancient practice apparently. He told me that I was someone who wasn't afraid of pain, and that was good, because in order to master the soul, one must also learn to master the body. He told me, too, that I was using pain in the way, and that was very bad. This uneducated woodcutter thought he knew me better than I did myself, and that annoyed me, but at the same time, I felt proud to think that my paintings were capable of expressing exactly what I was feeling. Maria was aware of a sharp stone cutting into her foot, but she could barely feel it for the cold. Her body was growing numb, and she could only just follow what Ralph's heart was saying. Why was it that in God's holy world men were only interested in showing her pain? Sacred pain, pain with pleasure, pain with explanations or without, but always pain, pain, pain. Her cut foot stumbled on another stone, she smothered a cry and continued on. At first, she had managed to maintain her integrity, her self-control, what he called her light. Now, though, she was walking very slowly, with her stomach and her mind churning, she felt as if she were about to throw up. She considered stopping, because none of this made any sense, but she didn't. And she didn't stop out of respect for herself. She could stand that barefoot walk as long as she had to, because it wouldn't last all her life. And suddenly another thought crossed her mind: what if she couldn't go to the Copacabana tomorrow night? She had injured feet, or because of a fever brought on by the flu that would doubtless install itself in her overexposed body. She thought of the customers who would be expecting her, of Milan who so trusted her, of the money she wouldn't earn, of the farm, of her proud parents. But the suffering soon drove out all such thoughts, and she kept placing one foot in front of the other, longing for Ralph's heart to recognize the effort she was making and to tell her she could stop and put her shoes back on again. He seemed entirely indifferent, distant, as if this were the only way of freeing her from something she didn't as yet really know about, something she found very seductive, but which would leave far deeper marks than any handcuffs. Although she knew he was trying to help her, and however hard she tried to go forward and show him the light of her willpower, the pain would not allow her any thoughts, noble or profane. It was just pain, rilling everything, frightening her and forcing her to think that she did have limits and that she wasn't going to make it. But she took one step, and another. The pain seemed about to invade her soul now and undermine her spiritually, because it's one thing to put on a bout of theater in a 5-star hotel, naked, with vodka and caviar inside you and a whip between your legs, but it's quite another to be cold and barefoot, with stones lacerating your feet. She was disoriented. She couldn't think of a single thing to say to Ralph's heart. All that existed in her universe were those small, sharp stones that formed the path between the trees. Then, just when she thought she was about to give up, she was filled by a strange feeling. She had reached her limit, and beyond it was an empty space, in which she seemed to float above herself, unaware of what she was feeling. Was this what the penitents had experienced? At the far extremity of pain, she had discovered a door into a different level of consciousness, and there was no room now for anything but implacable nature and her own invincible self. Everything around her became a dream: the ill-lit garden, the dark lake, the man walking beside her, saying nothing, the occasional couple out for a stroll, who failed to notice that she was barefoot and having difficulty walking. She didn't know if it was the cold or the pain, but she suddenly lost all sense of her own body and entered a state in which there was no desire and no fear, only a mysterious, how could she describe it? A mysterious peace. The pain barrier was not a barrier for her, she could go beyond it. She thought of all the people enduring unasked for suffering, and there she was, bringing suffering upon herself, but that didn't matter anymore. She had crossed the frontiers of the body, and now there was only soul, light, a kind of void, which someone, someday, called paradise. There are certain sufferings which can only be forgotten once we have succeeded in floating above our own pain. The next thing she knew, Ralph was picking her up and putting his jacket around her shoulders. She must have fainted from the cold, but she didn't care. She was happy she hadn't, afraid she had come through. She had not humbled herself before him. The minutes became hours. She must have gone to sleep in his arms, because when she woke up, although it was still dark, she was in a room with a TV in one corner, and nothing else. White, empty. Ralph appeared with a cup of hot chocolate. "Good," he said. "You got to the place you needed to get to." "I don't want hot chocolate, I want wine. And I want to go downstairs to our place by the fire, with books all around us." She had said our place. That wasn't what she had planned. She looked at her feet. Apart from a small cut, there were just a few red marks, which would disappear in a few hours' time. With some difficulty, she went downstairs, without really looking around her. She went and sat down on the rug by the fire. She had discovered that she always sit good there, as if that really was her place in the house. The woodcutter told me that whenever you do some amount of physical exercise, when you demand the maximum from your body, the mind gains a strange spiritual strength, which has to do with the lie. I saw in you. What did you feel? Felt that pain is woman's friend. That is the danger. I also felt that pain has its limits. That is the salvation. Don't forget that. Maria's mind was still confused. She had experienced that peace when she had gone beyond her own limits. He had shown her a different kind of suffering that had also given her a strange pleasure. Ralph picked up a large file and opened it up in front of her. It contained drawings. The history of prostitution. That's what you asked me for when we met. Yes, she had, but it had only been a way of making conversation, of trying to appear interesting. It was of no importance now. All this time, I've been sailing in uncharted waters. I didn't think there was a history. I thought it was just the oldest profession in the world, as people say. But there is a history, or, rather, two histories. And what are these drawings? Ralph Hart looked slightly disappointed at her apparent lack of interest in what he had said, but quickly set aside these feelings and went on. They're the drawings I jotted D0mm as I was reading, researching, learning. Let's talk about that another day. I don't want to change the subject today. I need to understand about pain. You experienced pain yesterday and you discovered that it led to pleasure. You experienced it today and found peace. That's why I'm telling you, don't get used to it because it's very easy to become habituated. It's a very powerful drug. It's in our daily lives, in our hidden suffering, in the sacrifices we make, blaming love for the destruction of our dreams. Pain is frightening when it shows its teal face, but it's seductive when it comes disguised as sacrifice or self-denial. Or cowardice. However much we may reject it, we human beings always find a way of being with pain, of flirting with it and making it part of our lives. I don't believe that. No one wants to suffer. If you think you can live without suffering, that's a great step forward, but don't imagine that other people will understand you. True, no one wants to suffer, and yet nearly everyone seeks out pain and sacrifice, and then they feel justified, pure, deserving of the respect of their children, husbands, God. Don't let's think about that now. All you need to know is that what makes the world go round is not the search for pleasure, but the renunciation of all that is important. Does a soldier go to war in order to kill the enemy? No, he goes in order to die for his country. Does a wife want to show her husband how happy she is? No, she wants him to see how devoted she is, how she suffers in order to make him happy. Does the husband go to work thinking he will find personal fulfillment there? No, he is giving his sweat and tears for the good of the family. And so it goes on. Sons give up their dreams to please their parents, parents give up their lives in order to please their children. Pain and suffering are used to justify the one thing that should bring only love. Stop. Ralph stopped. It was the right moment to change the subject, and he started showing her drawing after drawing. At first, it all seemed rather confusing. There were a few outlines of people, but also scrawls and scribbles, geometric shapes and colors. Gradually, though, she to understand what he was saying, because each word he spoke was accompanied by a gesture of the hand, and each phrase placed her in the world which, up until then, she had always denied she was part of, telling herself that it was just one stage in her life, a way of earning money, nothing more. Yes, I discovered that there is not just one history of prostitution, but two. The first one you know all too well, because it is your history too. A pretty young girl, for reasons which she has chosen or which have chosen her, decides that the only way she can survive is by selling her body. Some end up ruling nations, as Messalina did in Rome, others become legendary figures, like Madame du Barry, still others chase after adventure and misfortune, like the spy, Mata Hari. But the majority never have their moment of glory, are never faced by a great challenge. They will always be young girls from the interior in search of fame, a husband, adventure, but who end up discovering quite a different reality, into which they plunge for a time, and to which they become accustomed, always believing that they are in control and ultimately unable to do anything else. Artists have been making sculptures and paintings and writing books for more than 3,000 years. In just the same way, throughout all that time, prostitutes have carried on their work as if nothing very much ever changes. Would you like to know details? Maria nodded. She needed time in order to understand about pain, although she was starting to feel as if something very bad had left her body during that walk in the park. Prostitutes appear in classical texts, in Egyptian hieroglyphs, in Sumerian writings, in the Old and New Testament. But the profession only started to become organized in the 6th century BC, when a Greek legislator, Solon, set up state-controlled brothels and began imposing taxes on the skin trade. Athenian businessmen were pleased because what was once prohibited became legal. The prostitutes, on the other hand, started to classified according to how much tax they paid. The cheapest were the porni, slaves who belonged to the owners of the establishment. Next came the peripatetica, who picked up her clients in the street. Lastly, the most expensive and highest quality, was the hetera, the female companion, who accompanied businessmen on their trips, dlned in chic restaurants, controlled her own money, gave advice, and meddled in the political life of the city. As you see, what happened then still happens now. In the Middle Ages, because of sexually transmitted diseases, fear of catching a cold, the heat of the fire necessary now to warm her body and her soul. Maria didn't want to hear any more history. It gave her a sense that the world had stopped, that everything was being endlessly repeated, and that mankind would never give sex the respect it deserved. You don't seem very interested. She pulled herself together. After all, he was the man to whom she had decided to give her heart, although now she wasn't so sure. I'm not interested in what I know about, it just makes me sad. You said there was another history. The other history is exactly the opposite, sacred prostitution. She had suddenly emerged from her somnolent state and was listening to him intently. Sacred prostitution? Earning money from sex and yet still able to approach God? The Greek historian, Herodotus, wrote of Babylonia, they have a strange custom here, by which every woman born in Sumeria is obliged, at least once in her lifetime, to go to the temple of the goddess Ishtar and give her body to a stranger, as a symbol of hospitality and for a symbolic price. She would ask him about that goddess later. Perhaps she would help her to recover something she had lost, although just what that was she did not know. The influence of the goddess Ishtar spread throughout the Middle East, as far as Sardinia, Sicily, and the Mediterranean ports. Later, during the Roman Empire, another goddess, Vesta, demanded total virginity or total surrender. In order to keep the sacred fire burning, the women serving her temple were responsible for initiating young men and kings on the path of sexuality. They sang erotic hymns, entered trance-like states and gave their ecstasy to the universe in a kind of communion with the divinity. Ralph Hart showed her a photocopy of some ancient lyrics, with a translation in German at the foot of the page. He read slowly, translating each line as he went. When I am sitting at the door of a tavern, I, Ishtar, the goddess, am prostitute, mother, wife, divinity. I am what people call life, although you call it death. I am what people call law, although you call it delinquency. I am what you seek and what you find. I am what you scattered and the pieces you now gather up. Maria was sobbing softly, and Ralph Hart laughed. His vital energy was returning, his light was beginning to shine. It was best to continue the history, to show her the drawings, to make her feel loved. No one knows why sacred prostitution disappeared, since it had lasted not centuries, perhaps, but for at least millennia. Maybe it was disease or because society changed its rules when it changed religions. Anyway, it no longer exists, and will never exist again. Nowadays, men control the world, and the term serves only to create a stigma, and any woman who steps out of line is automatically dubbed a prostitute. Could you come to the Copacabana tomorrow? Ralph didn't understand why she was asking this, but he agreed at once. From Maria's diary, after the night she walked barefoot in the Jardin Anglais in Geneva, I don't care whether it was once sacred or not, I hate what I do. It's destroying my soul, making me lose touch with myself, teaching me that pain is a reward, that money buys everything and justifies everything. No one around me is happy, the clients know they are paying for something that should be free, and that's depressing. The women know that they have to sell something which they would like to give out of pleasure and affection, and that is destructive. I've struggled long and hard before emptying this, before accepting how unhappy and dissatisfied I am. I needed and I still need to hold out for a few more weeks. But I cannot simply do nothing, pretend that everything is normal, that it's just a stage, a phase of my life. I want to forget it. I need to love, that's all, I need to love. Life is too short, or too long, for me to allot myself the luxury of living it so badly. It isn't his house. It isn't her house. It isn't Brazil or Switzerland. It's a hotel, which could be anywhere in the world, furnished, like all hotel rooms, in a way that tries to create a familiar atmosphere, but which only makes it seem all the more impersonal. It isn't the hotel with the lovely view of the lake and the memory of pain, suffering and ecstasy. It looks out onto the road to Santiago, a route of pilgrimage not penance, a place where people meet in the cafes along the road, discover each other's light, talk, become friends, fall in love. It's raining, and at this time of night, no one is walking there, although they have for years, decades, centuries. Perhaps the road needs to breathe, to rest from the many steps that trudge along it every day. Turn out the light. Close the curtains. She asks him to take his clothes off and she does the same. Darkness is never absolute, and as soon as her eyes become accustomed to it, she can see the man's silhouette, outlined against the faintest of lights coming from who knows where. The last time they met for Di's purpose, she left only part of her body naked. She takes 2 carefully folded handkerchiefs, which have been washed and rinsed several times to get rid of the slightest trace of perfume or soap. She goes over to him and asks him to blindfold himself. He hesitates for a moment and makes some remark about various hells he has been through before. She says it's nothing to do with that, she just needs total darkness. Now it is her turn to teach him something, just as yesterday he taught her about pain. He gives in and puts on the blindfold. She does the same. Now there is not a glimmer of light, they are in absolute darkness, and they have to hold hands in order to reach the bed. No, we mustn't lie down. Let's sit as we always do, face to face, only a little closer, so that my knees touch your knees. She has always wanted to do this, but she never had what she most needed, time. Not with her first boyfriend, or with the man who penetrated her for the first time. Not with the Arab who paid her 1,000 francs, perhaps hoping for more than she was able to give him, although 1,000 francs wouldn't be enough for her to buy what she wanted. Not with the many men who had passed through her body, who have come and gone between her legs, sometimes thinking about themselves, sometimes thinking about her too, sometimes harboring romantic dreams, sometimes instinctively repeating certain words because they have been told that that is what men do, and that if they don't, they are not real men. She thinks of her diary. She has had enough, she wants the remaining weeks to pass quickly, and that is why she was giving herself to this man, because the light of her own love lies hidden there. Original sin was not the apple that Eve ate, it was her belief that Adam needed to share precisely the thing she had tasted. Eve was afraid to follow her path without someone to help her, and so she wanted to share what she was feeling. Certain things cannot be shared. Nor can we be afraid of the oceans into which we plunge of our own free will. Fear cramps everyone's style. Man goes through hell in order to understand this. Love one another, but let's not try to possess one another. I love this man sitting before me now, because I do not possess him and he does not possess me. We are free in our mutual surrender. I need to repeat this dozens, hundreds, millions of times, until I finally believe my 0 words. She thinks about the other prostitutes who work with her. She thinks about her mother and her friends. They all believe that man feels desire for only 11 minutes a day, and that they'll pay a fortune for it. That's not true. A man is also a woman. He wants to find someone to give meaning to his life. Does her mother behave just as she does and pretend to have an orgasm with her father? Or in the interior of Brazil, is it still forbidden for a woman to take pleasure in sex? She knows so little of life and love, and now, with her eyes unfolded and with all the time in the world, she is discovering the origin of everything, and everything begins where and how she would like it to have begun. Touch. Forget prostitutes, clients, her mother and her now she is in total darkness. She has spent the whole afternoon wondering what she could give to a man who had restored her dignity and made her understand that the search for happiness is more important than the need for pain. I would like to give him the happiness of teaching me something new, just as yesterday he taught me about suffering, street prostitutes and sacred prostitutes. I saw how much he enjoys teaching me things, so let him teach me, guide me. I would like to know how one reaches the body, without going via the soul, penetration, orgasm. She holds out her hand and asks him to do the same. She whispers a few words, saying that tonight, in this no man's land, she would like him to discover her skin, the boundary between her and the world. She asks him to touch her, to feel her with his hands, because bodies always understand each other, even when souls do not. He touching her, and she touches him too, and, as if by prior agreement, they both avoid the parts of the body where sexual energy surfaces most rapidly. His fingers touch her face, and she can smell just a hint of ink on them, a smell that will stay there forever, even if he washes his hands thousands and millions of times, a smell which was there when he was born, when he saw his first tree, his first house, and decided to draw them in his dreams. He must be able to smell something on her hands too, but she doesn't know what, and doesn't want to ask, because at that moment everything is body, and the rest is silence. She caresses and is caressed. She could stay like this a night, because it is so pleasurable and won't necessarily end in sex, and at that moment, precisely because there is no obligation to have sex, she feels hot between her legs and knows that she has become wet. When he touches her there, he will discover this, and she doesn't know if this is good or bad, this is just how her body is reacting, and she doesn't intend telling him to go here or there, more slowly, or more quickly. His hands are touching her armpits now, the hairs on her arms stand on end, and she feels like pushing his hands away, but it feels good, although perhaps it is pain she is feeling. She does the same to him and notices that the skin in his armpits has a different texture, perhaps because of the deodorant they both use, but what is she thinking of? She mustn't think. She must touch, that is all. His fingers trace circles around her breast, like an animal watching. She wants them to move more quickly, to touch her nipples, because her thoughts are moving faster than his hands, but, perhaps knowing this, he provokes, lingers, takes an age to get there. Her nipples are hard now. He plays with them a little, and that causes more goose pimples, causes her to become hotter and wetter. Now he is moving across her belly, then D0mn to her legs, her feet. He strokes his hands up and down her inner thigh. He feels the heat, but does not approach. His touch is soft, light, and the odoritis the more intoxicating. She does the same, her hands almost floating over his and touching only the hairs on his legs, and she too feels the need when she approaches his genitals. Suddenly, it is as if she had mysteriously recovered her virginity, as if she were discovering a man's body for the first time. She touches his penis. It is not as hard as she imagined, and yet she is so wet, how unfair, but maybe a man needs more time, who knows, and she begins to stroke it as only virgins know how, because prostitutes have long since forgotten. The man reacts, his penis to grow in her hands, and she slowly increases the pressure, knowing now where she should touch, more at the bottom than at the top. She must wrap her fingers around it, push the skin back, towards his body. Now he is excited, very excited. He touches the lips of her vagina, still very softly, and she feels like asking him to be more forceful, to put his fingers right inside. But he doesn't do that. He moistens the clitoris with a little of the liquid pouring from her womb, and again makes the same circular movements he made on her nipples. This man touches her exactly as she would touch herself. One of his hands goes back to her breast. It feels so good, she wishes he would put his arms around her now. But, no, they are discovering the body, they have time, they need a lot of time. They could make love now, it would be the most natural thing in the world, and it might be good, but all this is so new, she needs to control herself, she does not want to spoil everything. She remembers the wine they drank on that first night, how they sipped it slowly, savoring each mouthful, how she felt it warming her, and how it made her see the world differently and left her more at ease and more in touch with life. She wants to drink that man too, and then she can forget forever the cheap wine that you gulp down and that makes you feel drunk, but always leaves you with a headache and an empty space in your soul. She stops, slowly entwines her fingers with his. She hears a moan and would like to moan too, but she stops herself. She feels heat spreading throughout her body. The same thing must be happening to him. Without an orgasm, the energy disperses, travels to the brain, not letting her think of anything but going all the way. But this is what she wants, to stop halfway, to spread the pleasure through her whole body, to allow it to invade her mind, renewing her commitment and her desire, restoring her virginity. She gently removes the blindfold from her eyes and removes his too. She turns on the bedside lamp. Both are naked, they do not smile, they simply look at each other. I am love, I am music, she thinks. Let's dance. But she doesn't say anything. They talk about something trivial, about when they will next meet. She suggests a date, perhaps in 2 days' time. He says he would like to invite her to an exhibition, but she hesitates. That would mean getting to know his world, his friends, and what would they say, what would they think? She says no, but he realizes that she really wants to say yes, and so he insists, using a few foolish arguments, but which are all part of the dance they are dancing now, and in the end she agrees, because that is what she would like. They arrange where to meet, in the same cafe where they met that first day. No, she says, Brazilians are very superstitious, and you must never meet in the same place where you first met, because that might close a cycle and bring everything to an end. He says that he's glad she doesn't want to close that particular cycle. They decide to meet at a church from where you can see the whole city, and which is on the road to Santiago, part of the mysterious pilgrimage that the two of them have been on ever since they met. From Maria's diary, on the eve of buying her ticket back to Brazil, once upon a time, there was a bird. He was adorned with 2 perfect wings and with glossy, colorful, marvelous feathers. In short, he was a creature made to fly about freely in the sky, bringing joy to everyone who saw him. One day, a woman saw this bird and fell in love with him. She watched his flight, her mouth wide in amazement, her heart pounding, her eyes shining with excitement. She invited the bird to fly with her, and the two traveled across the sky in perfect harmony. She admired and venerated and celebrated that bird. But then she thought, he might want to visit far-off mountains. And she was afraid that she would never feel the same way about any other bird. And she felt envy for the bird's ability to fly, and she felt alone. And she thought, I'm going to set a trap. The next time the bird appears, he will never leave again. The bird, who was also in love, returned the following day, fell into the trap and was put in a cage. She looked at the bird every day. There he was, the object of her passion, and she showed him to her friends, who said, now you have everything you could possibly want. However, a strange transformation began to take place. Now that she had the bird and no longer needed to woo him, she began to lose interest. The bird, unable to fly and express the true meaning of his life, began to waste away and his feathers to lose their gloss. He grew ugly, and the woman no longer paid him any attention, except by feeding him and cleaning out his cage. One day, the bird died. The woman felt terribly sad and spent all her time thinking about him. But she did not remember the cage. She thought only of the day when she had seen him for the first time, flying contentedly amongst the clouds. If she had looked more deeply into herself, she would have realized that what had thrilled her about the bird was his freedom, the energy of his wings in motion, not his physical body. Without the bird, her life too lost all meaning, and death came knocking at her door. Why have you come? She asked Death. So that you can fly once or with him across the sky, Death replied. If you had allowed him to come and go, you would have loved and admired him even more. Alas, you now need me in order to find him again. She started the day by doing something she had rehearsed over and over during all these past months. She went into a travel agent's and bought a ticket to Brazil for the date she had marked on her calendar, in 2 weeks' time. From then on, Geneva would be the face of a man she loved and who had loved her. Rue de Bern would just be a name, a homage to Switzerland's capital city. She would remember her room, the lake, the French language, the crazy things a 23-year-old woman, it had been her birthday the night before, is capable of, until she realizes there is a limit. She would not cage the bird, nor would she suggest he go with her to Brazil. He was the only truly pure dying that had happened to her. A bird like that must fly free and feed on nostalgia for the time when he flew alongside someone else. And she too was a bird. Having Ralph Hart by her side would mean remembering forever her days at the Copacabana. And that was her past, not her future. 11 minutes she decided to say goodbye just once, when the moment came for her to leave, rather than have to suffer every time she thought, soon I won't be here anymore. So she played a mind on her heart and, that morning, she walked around Geneva as if she had always known those streets, that hill, the road to Santiago, the Mont Blanc Bridge, the bars she used to go to. She watched the seagulls flying over the river, the market traders taking down their stalls, people leaving their offices to go to lunch, noticed the color and taste of the apple she was eating, the planes landing in the distance, the column of water rising up from the middle of the lake, the shy, concealed joy of passers-by, the looks she got, some full of desire, some expressionless. She had lived for nearly a year in a small town, like so many other small towns in the world, and if it hadn't been for the architecture peculiar to the place and the excessive number of banks, it could have been the interior of Brazil. There was a fair. There was a market. There were housewives haggling over prices. There were students who had skipped a class at school, on the excuse perhaps that their mother or their father was ill, and who were now strolling by the river, exchanging kisses. There were people who felt at home and people who felt foreign. There were tabloid newspapers full of scandals and respectable magazines for businessmen, who, however, were only ever to be seen reading the scandal sheets. She went to the library to return the manual on farm management. She hadn't understood a word of it, but, at times when she felt she had lost control of herself and of her destiny, the book had served as a reminder of her objective in life. It had been a silent companion, with its peach-yellow cover, its series of graphs, but, above all, it had been a lighthouse in the dark nights of our accent weeks. Always making plans for the future, and always be surprised by the present, she thought to herself. She felt had discovered herself through independence, despair, love, pain, and back again to love, and she would like things to end there. The oddest thing of all was that, while some of her work colleagues spoke of the wonder or the ecstasy of going to bed with certain men, she had never discovered anything either good or bad about herself through sex. She had not solved her problem. She could still not have an orgasm through penetration, and she had vulgarized the sexual act so much that she might never again find the embrace of recognition, as Ralph Hart called it, or the fire and joy she sought. Or perhaps, as she occasionally thought, and as mothers, fathers, and romances all said, love was necessary if one was to experience pleasure in bed. The normally serious librarian, and Maria's only friend, although she had never told her so, was in a good mood. She was having a bite to eat and invited her to share a sandwich. Maria thanked her and said that she had just eaten. "You took a long time to read this. I didn't understand a word. Do you remember what you asked me once?" No, she didn't, but when she saw the mischievous look in the other woman's face, she guessed. Sex. No, after you came here in search of books on the subject, I decided to make a list of what we had. It wasn't much, and since we need to educate our young people in such matters, I ordered a few more books. At least, this way they won't need to learn about sex in that worst of all possible ways, by going with prostitutes. The librarian pointed to a pile of books in a corner, all discreetly covered in brown paper. I haven't had time to catalog them yet, but I had a quick glance through and I was horrified by what I read. Maria could imagine what the woman was going to say: embarrassing positions, sadomasochism, things of that sort. She had better tell her that she had to get back to work. She couldn't remember whether she had told her she worked in a bank or in a shop. Lying made life so complicated. She was always forgetting what she had said. She thanked her and was about to leave, when the other woman said, "You'd be horrified too. Did you know, for example, that the clitoris is a recent invention?" An invention? Recent? Just this week someone had touched hers, as if it had always been there and as if those hands knew the terrain they were exploring well, despite the total darkness. It was officially accepted in 1559, after a doctor, Rildero Colombo, published a book entitled De Re Anatomica. It was officially ignored for 1500 years or Christian era. Colombo describes it in his book as a pretty and a useful thing. Can you believe it? They both laughed. 2 years later, in 1561, another doctor, Gabriele Falloppio, said that he had discovered it. Imagine two men, Italians, of course, who know such things, arguing about who had officially added the clitoris to the history books. It was an interesting conversation, but Maria didn't want to drink about this ethics, mainly because she could already feel the juices flowing in her vagina getting wet just remembering his touch, the blindfolds, his hands moving over her body. No, she wasn't dead to sex. That man had managed to rescue her. It was good to be alive. The librarian, however, was warming to her subject. Its discovery didn't mean it received any more respect, though. The librarian seemed to have become an expert on clitorology, or whatever that science is called. The mutilations we read about now in certain African tribes, who still insist on removing the woman's right to sexual pleasure, are nothing new. In the 19th century, here in Europe, they were still performing operations to remove it, in the belief that in that small, insignificant part of the female anatomy lay the root of hysteria, epilepsy, adulterous tendencies, and sterility. Maria held out her hand to say goodbye, but the librarian showed no signs of tiring. Worse still, dear Dr. Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, said that in a normal woman, the female orgasm should move from the clitoris to the vagina. His most faithful Freud went further and said that if a woman's sexuality remained concentrated in the clitoris, this was infantilism or, worse, bisexuality. And yet, as we all know, it is very difficult to have an organism through penetration. It's good to have sex with a man, but pleasure lies in that little nub discovered by an Italian. Distracted, Maria realized that she had that problem diagnosed by Freud. She was still in the infantile stage. Her orgasm had not moved to the vagina. Or was Freud am Tong? And what do you think about the G-spot? Do you know where it is? The other woman blushed and coughed, but managed to say, as you go in, on the first floor, the back window. Brilliant. She had described the vagina as if it were a building. Perhaps she had read that explanation in a book for young girls, to say that if someone knocks on the door and comes in, you'll discover a whole universe inside your own body. Whenever she masturbated, she preferred to concentrate on her G-spot rather than on the clitoris, since the latter made her feel rather uncomfortable, a pleasure mingled with real pain, rather troubling. She always went straight to the first floor, to the back window. Seeing that the librarian was clearly never going to stop talking, perhaps because she had discovered in Maria an accomplice to her own lost sexuality, she gave a wave of hand and left, trying to concentrate on whatever nonsense came into her head, because this was not a day to think about farewells, clitorises, restored virginities, or G-spots focused on what was going on around her. Bells RI dogs barking, a tram rattling over the tracks, footstep own breathing, the signs offering everything. She did not feel like going back to the Copacabana, and yet she felt an obligation to work until the end, although she had no real idea why. After all, she had saved enough money. She could spend the afternoon doing some shopping, talking to the bank manager, who was a client of hers, but who had promised to help her manage her savings, having a cup of coffee somewhere, sending off the clothes that wouldn't fit into her suitcases. It was strange, for some reason, she was feeling rather sad, perhaps because it was still another 2 weeks before she would leave, and she needed to get through that time, to look at the city with different eyes and feel glad for what she had experienced there. She came to a crossroads where she had been hundreds of times before. You could see the lake from there and the water spout, and, on the far pavement, in the middle of the public gardens, the lovely floral clock, one of the city's symbols, and that clock would not allow her to lie, because suddenly, time and the world stood still. What was this story she had been telling herself since the morning? Something about her recently restored virginity. The world seemed frozen, that second would never end, as face to face with something very serious and very important in her life, she could not just forget about it, she could not do as she did with her nighttime dreams, which she has promised herself she would write down, and whenever did, she don't think about anything. The world has stopped. What's going on? Enough. The bird, the lovely story about the bird she had just emptied, was it Ralph Hart? No, it was about her. Full stop. It was 5:00 in the morning, and she was frozen in that moment. She was a foreigner inside her 0mm body, she was rediscovering her recently restored virginity, but its rebirth was so fragile that if she stayed there, it would be lost forever. She had experienced heaven, perhaps, certainly hell, but the adventure was coming to an end. She couldn't wait 2 weeks, 10 days, 1 week, she needed to leave now, because, as she stood looking at the floral clock, with tourists taking pictures of it and children playing all around, she had just found out why she was sad. And the reason was eyes. She didn't want to go back. And the reason she didn't want to go back wasn't Ralph Hart, Switzerland, or adventure. The real reason couldn't have been simpler: money. Money. A special piece of paper, decorated in somber colors, which everyone agreed was worth something, and she believed it, everyone believed it, until you took a piece of that paper to a bank, a respectable, traditional, highly confidential Swiss bank, and asked, "Could I buy back a few hours of my life?" "No, madam, we don't sell, we only buy." Maria was woken from her delirium by the sound zero screeching brakes, a motorist shouting, and a smiling gentleman, speaking English, telling her to step back onto the pavement. The pedestrian light was red. But this can't be exactly an earth-shattering discovery. Everyone must feel what I feel. They must know. But they didn't. She looked around her. People were walking along, heads down, hurrying off to work, to school, to the employment agency, to Rue de Berne, telling themselves, "I can wait a little longer. I have a dream, but there's no need to realize it today. Besides, I need to earn some money." Of course, everyone spoke ill of her profession, but, basically, It was all a question of selling her time, like everyone else. Doing things she didn't want to do, like everyone else. Putting up with horrible people, like everyone else. Handing over her precious body and her precious soul in the name of a future that never arrived, like everyone else. Saying that she still didn't have enough, like everyone else. Waiting just a little bit longer, like everyone else. Waiting so that she could earn just a little bit more, postponing the realization of her dreams. She was too busy right now. She had a great opportunity ahead of her, loyal clients who were waiting for her, who could pay Benveen 350 and 1,000 francs a session. And for the first time in her life, despite all the good things she could buy with the money she might earn, who knows, she might only have to work another year, she decided consciously, lucidly, and deliberately to let an opportunity pass her by. Maria waited for the light to change. She crossed the street and paused in front of the floral clock. She thought of Ralph, saw again the look of desire in his eyes on the night when she had slipped off the top half of her dress, felt his hands touching her breasts, her sex, her face, and she became wet, and as she looked at the vast column of water in the distance, without even having to touch any part of her own body, she had an orgasm right there, in front of everyone. Not that anyone noticed, they were all far too busy. Janaya, the only one of her work colleagues with whom she had a relationship that could be described as friendship, called her over as soon as she came in. She was sitting with an Oriental gentleman, and they were laughing. "Look at this," she said to Maria. "Look what he wants me to do with him." The Oriental gentleman gave a knowing look and, still smiling, opened the lid of what looked like a cigar box. Milan was watching from a distance in case it contained syringes or drugs. It did not. It was something that even he didn't know quite what to do with, but it wasn't anything very special. "It looks like something from the last century," said Maria. "It is," said the Oriental gentleman indignantly. "It's over 100 years old and it cost a fortune." What Maria saw was a series of valves, a handle, electric circuits, small metal contacts and batteries. It looked like the inside of an ancient radio, with two wires sticking out, at the ends of which were small glass rods, about the thickness of a finger. It certainly didn't look like something that had cost a fortune. "How does it work?" Had Elnaya didn't like Maria's question. Although she trusted Maria, people could change from one moment to the next and she might have her eye on her client. "He's already explained. It's the violet rod." And turning to the Oriental man, she suggested that they leave, because she had decided to accept his invitation. However, the man seemed pleased that his toy should have aroused such interest. Around 1900, when the first batteries came onto the market, traditional medicine started experimenting with electricity to see if it could cure mental illness or hysteria. It was also used to get rid of spots and to stimulate the skin. "You see these two ends? Well, they were placed here," he indicated his temples, "and the battery created the same sort of static electricity that you get in Switzerland when the air's very dry." Static electricity was something that never happened in Brazil, but was very common in Switzerland. Maria had discovered it one day when she opened the door of a taxi. She had heard a crack and received a shock. She thought there must be something wrong with the car and had complained, saying that she wasn't going to pay the fare and the driver had insulted her and told her she was stupid. He was right, it wasn't the car, it was the dry air. On receiving several more shocks, she began to be array touching anything made of metal, until she discovered one supermarket a bracelet she could wear that discharged electricity accumulated in the body. She turned to the man, "But that's really nasty." Naya was getting more and more irritated by Maria's remarks. In order to avoid future conflicts with her only possible friend, she kept her arm around the man's shoulder, thus leaving no room for doubt as to who he belonged to. "It depends where you put it," said the man, laughing loudly. He turned the little handle and the two rods seemed to turn violet. He quickly placed them on the two women. There was a crack, but the shock was more ticklish than painful. Milan came over. "Would you mind not using that in here, please?" The man put the rods back inside. The Naya seized the moment and suggested that they go straight to the hotel. The man seemed rather disappointed, since the new arrival seemed far more interested in his machine than the woman who was now suggesting they go back to his hotel. He put on his jacket and stowed the box away inside a leather briefcase, saying, "They've started making them again now. They've quite fashionable amongst people in search of special pleasures. But you'd only find ones like this in rare medical collections, museums, and antique shops." Milan and Maria just stood there, not knowing what to say. "Have you ever seen one before?" "Not like that, no. It probably did cost a fortune, but he's a top executive with an oil company. RVE seen modern ones, though." "What do they do with them?" "The man puts them inside his body and then asks the woman to turn the handle. He gets an electric shock inside." "Couldn't he do that on his own?" "You can do most kinds of sexual activity on your MVN, but if they stopped believing that it was more fun with another person, my bar would go bankrupt and you would have to find work in a greengrocer's shop. By the way, your special client said that he would be here tonight, so make sure you turn down any other offers." "Oh, I will, including his. I came to say goodbye. I'm leaving." Milan appeared not to react. "Is it the painter?" "No, it's the Copacabana. There's a limit to everything, and I reached mine this morning when I was looking at that floral clock near the lake." "And what is the limit?" "The price of a farm in the interior of Brazil. I know I could earn more money, that I could work for another year. After all, what difference would it make?" "Well, I know what difference it would make. I would be caught in this trap forever, just as you are and the clients they are, the businessmen, the air stewards, the talent scouts, the record company executives, the many men I have known to whom I have sold my time and which they can't sell to me. If I stay another day, I'll be here for another year, and if I stay another year, I'll never leave." Milan nodded discreetly, as if he understood and agreed with everything she had said, although he couldn't actually say anything, for fear of infecting all the other girls who worked for him. He was a good man, and although he didn't give her his blessing, neither did he try to convince Maria that she was wrong. She thanked him and asked for a drink, a glass of champagne. She couldn't stand another fruit juice cocktail. She could drink now that she wasn't working. Milan told her to phone him if ever she needed anything, she would always be welcome. She made to pay for the drink, and he said it was on the house. She accepted. She had, after all, given that house a great deal more than one drink. From Maria's diary, when she got home, "I don't remember exactly when, but one Sunday recently, I decided to go to church to attend Mass. After some time, I realized that I was in the wrong church. It was a Protestant church. I was about to leave, but the vicar was just beginning his sermon, and I thought it would be rude to get up at that point, and it was a real blessing, because that day I heard things I very much needed to hear. He said something like, 'In all the languages in the world, there is the same proverb, what the eyes don't see, the heart doesn't grieve over.' Well, I say that there isn't an ounce of truth in it. The further off they are, the closer to the heart are all those feelings that we try to repress and forget. If we're in exile, we want to store away every tiny memory of our roots. If we're far from the person we love, everyone we pass in the street reminds us of them. The Gospels and all the sacred texts of all religions were written in exile, in search of God's understanding, of the faith that moves whole peoples, of the pilgrimage of souls wandering the face of the earth. Our ancestors did not know, as we do not know, what the divinity expects from our lives, and it is out of that doubt that books are written, pictures painted, because we don't want to forget who we are, nor can we. At the end of the service, I went up to him and thanked him. I said that I was a stranger in a strange land, and I thanked him for reminding me that what the eyes don't see, the heart does grieve over. And my heart has grieved so much, that today I'm leaving. She picked up her 2 suitcases and put them on the bed. They had always been there, waiting for the day when everything would come to an end. She had imagined that she would fill them with presents, new clothes, photographs of snow and of the great European capitals, souvenirs of a happy time when she had lived in the safest and most generous country in the world. She had a few new clothes, it was true, and a few photos taken in the snow that fell one day in Geneva, but apart from that, Nothing was as she had imagined it would be. She had arrived with the dream of earning lots of money, learning life, and who she was, buying a farm for her parents, finding a husband, and bringing her family over to see where she lived. She was returning with just enough money to realize one of those dreams, without ever having visited the mountains and, worse still, a stranger to herself. But she was happy. She knew the time had come to stop. Not many people do. She had had only 4 adventures: being a dancer in a cabaret, learning French, working as a prostitute, and falling hopelessly in love. How many people can boast of experiencing so much excitement in 1 year? She was happy, despite the sadness, and that sadness had a name. It wasn't prostitution, or Switzerland, or money, it was Ralph Hart. Although she had never acknowledged it to herself, deep down, she would like to have married him, that man who was now waiting for her in a church, ready to take her off to see his friends, his paintings, his world. She considered standing him up and getting a room in a hotel near the airport, since the flight left early the next morning. From now on, every minute spent by his side would a year of suffering in the future, for everything she could have said to him and didn't, for her memories of his hands, his voice, his loving support, and his stories. She opened one suitcase and took out the little carriage from the electric train set that he had given her on that first night in his house. She looked at it for a few minutes, then threw it in the bin. It didn't deserve to go to Brazil, and it had proved useless and unfair to the child who had always wanted it. No, she wouldn't go to the church. He might ask her something tomorrow, and if she was honest and told him that she was leaving, he would beg her to stay and promise her everything in order not to lose her at that moment. He would openly declare all the love he had already shown to her during the time they had spent together. But their relationship was based on freedom, and no other sort of relationship would work. Perhaps that was the only reason they loved each other, because they knew they did not need each other. Men always take offense when a woman says, "I need you," and Maria wanted to take away with her the image of a Ralph Hart who was utterly in love and utterly hers, and ready to do anything for her. She still had time to decide whether or not to go and meet him. At the moment, she needed to concentrate on more practical matters. She looked at all the things she couldn't pack and which she had no idea what to do with. She decided that the owner could decide on their fate when he came to check the apartment and found all the household appliances in the kitchen, the pictures bought in a second-hand market, the towels, and the bedclothes. She couldn't take any of that with her to Brazil. Even though her parents had more need of them than any Swiss beggar, they would always remind her of everything she had risked. She left the apartment and went to the bank and asked to withdraw all her money. The manager, who had been to bed with her in the past, said that this really wasn't a good idea, since her francs would continue earning money and she could receive the interest in Brazil. Besides, what if she were mugged? That would mean months of work wasted. Maria hesitated for a moment, thinking as she always did, that he really was trying to help. However, after reflecting a moment, she concluded that the point of the money was not that it should be transformed into more paper, but into a farm, a home for her parents, a few cattle and a lot more work. She withdrew every last centime, put it in a small bag she had bought specially for the occasion and attached it to a belt beneath her clothes. She went to the travel agency, praying that she would have the courage to go through with her decision. Vivienne, she said she wanted to get a different flight. She was told that if she went on tomorrow's flight, she would have to change planes in Paris. That didn't matter, all she needed was to get far enough away from there before she had second thoughts. She walked to one of the bridges and bought an ice cream, even though the weather had started to get cold again, and she took one last look at Geneva. Everything seemed different to her, as if she had just arrived and needed to visit the museums, the historical monuments, the fashionable bars and restaurants. It's odd how, when you live in a city, you always postpone getting to know it and usually end up never knowing it at all. She thought she would feel happy because she was going home, but she wasn't. She thought she would feel sad because she was leaving a city that had treated her so well, but she didn't. The only thing she could do now was to shed a few tears, feeling rather afraid of herself, an intelligent young woman, who had everything going for her, but who tended to make the wrong decisions. She just hoped that this time she was right. The church was completely empty when she went in, and she was able to examine in silence the splendid stained glass windows, lit from outside by the light of a day washed clean by last night's storm. Before her stood an empty cross. She was confronted not by an instrument of torture, by the bloodied body of a dying man, but by a symbol of resurrection, in which the instrument of torture had lost all its meaning, its terror, its importance. She remembered the whip on that night of thunder and lightning. It was the same thing. Dear God, what am I saying? She was pleased too not to see any images of suffering saints, covered in blood stains and open wounds. The eyes was simply a place where people gathered to worship something they could not understand. She stood in front of the monstrance, in which was kept the body of a Jesus in whom she still believed, although she had not thought about him for a long time. She knelt down and promised God, the Virgin, Jesus and all the saints that whatever happened that day, she would not change her mind and would leave anyway. She made this promise cause she knew love's traps all too well, and knew why they can change a woman's mind. Shortly afterwards, she felt a hand touch her shoulder and she inclined her head so that her face rested on the hand. How are you? I'm fine, she said in a voice without a trace of anxiety in it. I'm fine. Let's go and have a coffee. They left the church hand in hand, as if they were two lovers meeting again after a long time. They kissed in public, and a few people shot them scandalous looks, but they both smiled at the unease they were causing and at the desires they were provoking by their scandalous behavior, because they knew that, in fact, those people wished they could be doing the same thing. That was the real scandal. They went into a cafe which was the same as all the others, but that afternoon, it was different, because they were there together and because they loved each other. They talked about Geneva, the difficulties of the French language, the stained glass windows in the church, the evils of smoking. Both of them smoked and hadn't the slightest intention of giving up. She insisted on paying for the coffee and he accepted. They went to the exhibition and she got to know his world, the artists, the rich who looked richer than they actually were, the millionaires who looked poor, the people discussing things she had never even heard about. They all liked her and praised her French. They asked carnival, football, Brazilian music. They were nice, polite, kind, charming. When they left, he said that he would come to the club that night to see her. She asked him not to. She had the night off and would like to invite him out to supper. He accepted and they said goodbye, arranging to meet at his house before going to have supper at a delightful restaurant in the little square in Cologne, which they had often driven past in the taxi, and where she had always wanted to stop, but had never asked to. Then Maria remembered her one friend and decided to go to the library to tell her that she would not be coming back. She got caught up in the traffic for what seemed like an eternity, until the Kurds had, once more, finished their demonstration and the cars could move freely again. Now, however, she was the mistress of her own time, and it didn't matter. By the time she reached the library, it was just about to close. Forgive me if I'm being too personal, but I haven't anyone else, any woman friend, I can talk to about certain things, said the librarian as soon as Maria came in. She didn't have any women friends. After spending her whole life in the same place and meeting all kinds of people at work, did she really have no one she could talk to? Maria had found someone like herself, or, rather, like everyone else. I was thinking about what I read about the clitoris. Didn't she ever think about anything else? It's just that, although I used to enjoy sex with my husband, I always found it very difficult to reach orgasm during intercourse. Do you think that's normal? Do you find it normal that there are daily demonstrations by Kurds? That women in love run away from their Prince Charming? That people dream about farms rather than love? That men and women sell their time, but can never buy it back again? And yet, all these things happen, so it really doesn't matter what I believe or don't believe, all these things are normal. Everything that goes against nature, against our most intimate desires, is normal in our eyes, even though it's an aberration in God's eyes. We seek out our own inferno, we spend millennia building it, and after all that effort, we are now able to live in the worst possible way. She looked at the woman standing in front of her and, For the first time, she asked what her name was. She only knew her surname. Her name was Heidi. She was married for 30 years and never during that time had she asked herself if it was normal not to have an orgasm during intercourse with her husband. I don't know if I should have read all those things. Perhaps it would have been better to live in ignorance, believing that a faithful husband, an apartment with a view of the lake, 3 children, and a job in the public sector were all that a woman could hope for. Now, ever since you arrived, and since I read the first book, I'm obsessed with what my life has become. Is everyone the same? I can guarantee you that they are. And standing before that woman who was asking her advice, Maria felt hers to be very wise. Would you like me to give you details? Maria nodded. You're obviously too young to understand these things, but that's precisely why I would like to share a little of my life with you, so that you don't make the same mistakes I did. But why is it that my husband never noticed my clitoris? He assumed that the orgasm happened in the vagina, and I found it really difficult to pretend something that he imagined I must be feeling. Of course, I did experience pleasure, but a different kind of pleasure. It was only when the friction was on the upper part. Do you know what I mean? I know. And now I know why. It's in there. She pointed to a book on her desk, whose title Maria couldn't see. There are lots of nerve endings that connect the clitoris and the G-spot and which are crucial to orgasm. But men think that penetration is all. Do you know what the G-spot is? Yes, we talked about it the other day, said Maria, slipping into the role of innocent girl. As you go in, on the first floor, the back window. That's right. And the librarian's eyes lit up. Just you ask how many of your male friends have heard of it. None of them. It's absurd. But just as an Italian discovered the clitoris, the G-spot is a 20th century discovery. Soon it will be in all the headlines, and then no one will able to ignore it any longer. Have you any idea what revolutionary times we're living in? Maria glanced at her watch, and Heidi realized that she'd have to talk fast, in order to teach this pretty young woman that all women have the right to be happy and fulfilled, in order that the next generation should benefit from all these extraordinary scientific discoveries. Dr. Freud didn't agree because he wasn't a woman and, since he experienced his orgasm through his penis, he felt that women must, therefore, experience pleasure in their vagina. We've got to go back to basics, to what has always given us pleasure, the clitoris and the G-spot. Very few women enjoy a satisfactory sexual relationship, so if you have difficulty in getting the pleasure you deserve, let me suggest something: change position. Make your lover lie down and you stay on top. Your clitoris will strike his body harder and he will be getting the stimulus you need. Or, rather, the stimulus you deserve. Maria, meanwhile, was only pretending that she wasn't listening to the conversation. So she wasn't the only one. She didn't have a sexual problem, it was all just a question of anatomy. She felt like kissing the librarian, as if a gigantic weight had been lifted off her heart. How good to have discovered this while she was still young. What a marvelous day she was having. Heidi gave a conspiratorial smile. They may not know it, but we have an erection too. The clitoris becomes erect. They presumably meant men. Since this was such an intimate conversation, Maria decided to risk a question: have you ever had an affair? The librarian looked shocked. Her eyes gave off a km of sacred fire, she blushed scarlet, though whether out of rage or shame it was impossible to tell. After a while though, the battle between telling the truth or pretending ended. She simply changed the subject. Getting back to our erection, to our clitoris, did you know that it became rigid? Yes, I've known that ever since I was a child. Heidi seemed disappointed. Perhaps she had just never noticed. Nevertheless, she resolved to go on. Anyway, apparently, if you rub your ring around it, without touching the actual tip, you can experience even more intense pleasure. So take note. Men who do respect a woman's body immediately touch the tip, not knowing that this can sometimes be quite painful, don't you agree? So, after your first or second encounter, take control of the situation, get on top, decide how and when pressure should be applied, and increase and decrease the rhythm as you see fit. According to the book I'm reading, a frank conversation about it might also be a good idea. Did you ever have a frank conversation with your husband? Again, Heidi avoided this direct question, saying that dyings were different then. Now she was more interested in sharing her intellectual experiences. Try to think of your clitoris as the hands of a clock and ask your partner to move it back and forth between 11 and 1. Do you understand? Yes, she knew what the woman was talking about and didn't entirely agree, although the book wasn't far from the truth. As soon as she mentioned the word clock, though, Maria glanced at her watch, and explained that she had really come to say goodbye. Her job placement had come to an end. The woman seemed not to hear her. Would you like to borrow this book about the clitoris? No, thanks. RVE got other things to think about at the moment. And you don't want to borrow anything else? No. I'm going back to my own country, but I just wanted to thank you for always having treated me with such respect and understanding. Perhaps we'll meet again sometime. They shook hands and wished each other much happiness. Heidi waited until the girl had left, then thumped the desk. Why hadn't she seized the opportunity to share something which, the way things were going, would probably go to the grave with her? Since the girl had had the courage to ask if she had ever betrayed her husband, why had she not answered, now that she was discovering a new world in which women were finally acknowledging how difficult it was to achieve a vaginal orgasm? Oh well, it doesn't matter. The world isn't just about sex. No, it wasn't the most important thing in the world, but it was still important. She looked around her. Most of the thousands of books surrounding her were love stories. It was always the same: someone meets someone, falls in love, loses them and finds them again. There are souls speaking unto souls, there are distant places, adventures, sufferings, anxieties, but very rarely anyone saying, "Excuse me, sir, but why don't you try acquiring a better understanding of the female body?" Why didn't books talk openly about that? Perhaps people weren't really interested. Men would always go looking for novelty, they were still the troglodyte hunter, obeying the reproductive instinct of the human race. And what about women? In her personal experience, the desire to have a good orgasm with one's partner lasted only for the first few years, then the frequency of orgasms diminished, but no one talked about it, because every woman thought it was her problem alone. And so they lied, pretending that they found their husband's desire to make love every night oppressive. And by lying, they left other women feeling worried. They turned their thoughts to other things: children, cooking, timetables, housework, bills to pay, their husbands' affairs, which they tolerated, holidays abroad during which they were more concerned with their children than with themselves, their complicity, or even love, but no sex. She should have been more open with that young Brazilian woman, who seemed to her an innocent creature, old enough to be her daughter, and still incapable of understanding what the world was like. An immigrant, far from home, working hard at a boring job, waiting for a man she could marry, and with whom she could fake a few orgasms, find security, reproduce this mysterious human race, and then forget all about such things as orgasms, the clitoris, or the G-spot, which was only discovered in the 20th century. Being a good wife, a good mother, making sure there was nothing lacking in the home, masturbating occasionally in secret, thinking about some man who had passed her in the street and looked at her longingly, keeping up appearances. Why was the world so concerned with appearances? That is why she had not replied to the question, "Have you ever had an affair?" These things go with you to the grave, she thought. Her husband had been the only man in her life, although sex was now a thing of the remote past. He had been an excellent companion, honest, generous and good-humored, and had struggled to bring up the family and to keep all those who worked with him happy. He was the ideal man that all women dream of, and that is precisely why she felt so bad when she thought of how she had one day desired and been with another man. She remembered how they had met. She was coming back from the small mountain T0MRN of Davos, when all the train services were interrupted for some hours by an avalanche. She phoned home so that no one would be worried, bought a few magazines and prepared for a long wait at the station. That was when she noticed the man sitting next to her, along with his rucksack and sleeping bag. He had graying hair and sunburned skin, and was the only person in the station who didn't seem concerned about the absence of any trains. On the contrary, he was smiling and looking around him for someone to talk to. Heidi opened one of the magazines, but, sweet mystery of life. Her eyes happened to catch his and she didn't manage to look away quickly enough to avoid him coming over to her. Before she could, politely, say that she really needed to finish reading an important article, he began to talk. He told her that he was a writer and was returning from a meeting in Davos and that the delay would mean him missing his flight home. When they got to Geneva, would she mind helping him find a hotel? Heidi was watching him. How could anyone be so cheerful about missing a plane and having to wait in an uncomfortable train station until things were sorted out? The man began talking to her as if they were old friends. He told her about his travels, about the mystique of literary creation and, to her horror, about all the women he had known and loved in his lifetime. Heidi merely nodded and let him talk. Occasionally he would apologize for talking so much and ask her to tell him something about herself. But all she could say was, "Oh, I'm just an ordinary person, nothing very special." Suddenly, she found herself hoping that the train would never arrive. The conversation was so enthralling, she was discovering things that she had only encountered before in fiction. And since she would never see him again, she got up her nerve and, quite why she could never say, began asking him subjects of particular interest to her. Her marriage was going through a rough patch. Her husband was very demanding of her time, and Heidi wanted to know what she could do to make him happy. The man offered her some interesting explanations, told her a story, but didn't seem very comfortable talking her husband. "You're a very interesting woman," he said, something that no one had said to her for years. Heidi didn't know how to react. He saw her embarrassment and immediately started talking about deserts, mountains, lost cities, women with veiled faces or bare midriffs, about warriors, pirates, and wise men. The train arrived. They sat down next to each other, and she was no longer a married woman who lived in a chalet looking out over the lake and had 3 children to bring up. She was an adventurer arriving in Geneva for the first time. She looked at the mountains and the river and felt glad to sitting beside a man who wanted to go to bed with her, because that's all men think about, and who was doing his best to impress her. She wondered how many other men had felt the same, but to whom she had never given the slightest encouragement. That morning, however, the world had changed, and she was suddenly a 38-year-old adolescent, dazzled by this man's attempts to seduce her. It was the best feeling in the world. In the premature autumn of her life, when she thought she had everything she could possibly want, Di's man appeared at the train station and walked straight into her life without first asking permission. They got off at Geneva and she showed him a hotel, a cheap one, he said, because he should have left that morning and didn't have much money on him for another night in exorbitantly expensive Switzerland. He asked her to go up to the room with him, to see if everything was in order. Heidi knew what to expect, and nevertheless, she accepted his proposal. They shut the door. They kissed each other with wild abandon. He tore off her clothes and, dear God, he knew all about the female body, because he had known the sufferings and frustrations of so many women. They made love all afternoon and only when evening fell did the charm dissipate, and she said the words she would have preferred not to have said, "I must go home, my husband's expecting me." He lit a cigarette and they lay in silence for a few moments, and neither of them said goodbye. Heidi got up and left without looking back, knowing that, whatever either of them might say, no word or phrase would make any sense. She would never see him again, but, for a few hours, in the autumn of her despair, she had ceased to be a faithful wife, housewife, loving mother, exemplary public servant and constant friend, and reverted to being simply a woman. For a few days, her husband kept saying that she seemed different, either happier or sadder. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. A week later, everything was back to normal. What a shame I didn't tell that young woman, she thought. Not that she would have understood, she still lives in a world in which people are faithful and vows of love are forever. From Maria's diary, I don't know what he must have thought when he opened the door that night and saw me standing there, carrying 2 suitcases. "Don't worry," I said. "TM not moving in. Shall we go to supper?" He didn't say anything, just helped me in with my luggage. Then, without saying, "What's going on V?" or "How lovely to see you," he simply put his arms around me and started kissing me and touching my body, my breasts, my crotch, as if he had been waiting for this a long time and was now afraid that the moment would never come. He pulled off my jacket and my dress, leaving me naked, and there in the hall, without any ritual or preparation, without even time to say what would be good and what bad, with the cold wind blowing in under the front door, we made love for the first time. I thought perhaps I should tell him to stop, so that we could find somewhere more comfortable, so that we could have time to explore the immense world of our sensuality, but, at the same time, I wanted him inside me, because he was the man I had never possessed and would never possess again. That is why I could love him with all my energy, and have, at least for one night, what I'd never had before and what I would possibly never have again. He lay me down on the floor and entered me before I was aroused and ready, but the pain didn't bother me. On the contrary, I liked it like that, because he obviously understood that I was his and that he didn't need to ask permission. I wasn't there in order to teach him anything or to prove that I was more sensitive or more passionate than other women. I was there to say yes, you're welcome, that I too had been waiting for this, that I was pleased his total disregard for the rules we had created between us and that he was now demanding that we should be guided solely by our instincts, male and female. We were in the most conventional of positions, me underneath him, with my legs spread, and him on top of me, moving in and out, while I looked at him, with no desire to pretend or to moan or to do anything, just wanting to keep my eyes open so that I could remember every second, watch his face changing, his hands grabbing my hair, his mouth biting me, kissing me. No preliminaries, no caresses, no preparations, no sophistication, just him inside me and me inside his soul. He came and went, quickening and slowing the rhythm, stopping sometimes to look at me too, but he didn't ask if I was enjoying it, because he knew that this was the only way our souls could communicate at that moment. The rhythm increased, and I knew that the 11 minutes were coming to an end, and I wanted them to last forever, because it was so good. Ah, dear God, it was good, to be possessed and not to possess. And we had our eyes wide open all the time, until I noticed that at one point we were no longer seeing clearly anymore and we seemed to move into a dimension in which one was the Great Mother, the universe, the beloved, the sacred prostitute of the ancient rituals that he had told me about over wine and beside an open fire. I saw that he was about to come, and his arms gripped mine, his movements increased in intensity, and it was then that he shouted. He didn't moan, he didn't grind his teeth, he shouted. He yelled. He roared like an animal. A thought flashed through my mind that the neighbors might call the police, but it didn't matter, and I felt immense pleasure, because this was how it had been since the beginning of time, when the first man met the first woman and they made love for the first time, they shouted. Then his body collapsed onto mine, and I don't know how long we stayed there, our arms around each other. I stroked his hair as I had done only once before. On the night when we locked ourselves up in the darkness of the hotel room, I felt his racing heart gradually slow to its normal rate. His hands began delicately to move up and down my arms, making all the hairs on my body prickle. He must have had a practical thought, the weight of his body on mine, because he rolled over, took my hand, and we lay there staring up at the ceiling and the chandelier with its 3 light bulbs lit. "Good evening," I said. He drew me over so that my head was resting on his chest. For a long time, he just stroked me, and then he said good evening too. "The neighbors must have heard everything," I said, not knowing quite what to say next, because saying I love you at that juncture didn't make much sense. He knew that already, and so did I. "There's a terrific draft from under the door," he said, when he could have said, "Good. Let's go into the kitchen." We got up and I saw that he hadn't even taken off his trousers. He was dressed just as I had found him, only with his penis exposed. I put my jacket over my bare shoulders. We went into the kitchen, he made some coffee he smoked 2 cigarettes and I smoked one. Sitting at the table, he said thank you with his eyes, and I replied thank you too, but our mouths remained shut. 11 minutes he eventually got up the courage to ask about the suitcases. I'm flying back to Brazil tomorrow at midday. A woman knows when a man is important to her. Are men capable of that kind of realization? Or would I have to say, I love you, why'd he like to stay here with you, ask me to stay? Don't go. Yes, he had understood that he could say that to me. I have to. I made a promise. Because, if I hadn't, he might think that this was all going to last forever. And it wasn't. It was part of the dream of a young woman from the interior of a far-off country, who goes to the big city, well, not that big really, encounters all kinds of difficulties, but finds the man who loves her. So this was the happy ending to all the difficult times I had been through, and whenever I remembered my life in Europe, I would end with the story of a man passionately in love with me, and who would always be mine, because I had visited his soul. Ah, Ralph, you have no idea how much I love you. I think that perhaps we always fall in love the very first instant we see the man of our dreams, even though, at the time, reason may be telling us otherwise, and we may fight against that instinct, hoping against hope that we won't win, until there comes a point when we allow ourselves to be vanquished by our feelings. That happened on the night when I walked barefoot in the park, cold and in pain, but knowing how much you loved me. Yes, I love you very much, as I have never loved another man, and that is precisely why I am leaving, because, if I stayed, the dream would become reality, the desire to possess, to want your life to be mine, in short, all the things that transform love into slavery. It's best left like this, a dream. We have to be careful what we take from a country, or from life. You didn't have an orgasm, he said, trying to change the subject, to be careful and not to force the situation. He was afraid of losing me, and was thinking that he still had all night to make me change my mind. No, I didn't, but I had an enormous amount of pleasure. But it would have been better if you'd had an orgasm too. I could have pretended, just to please you, but you don't deserve that. Ralph Hart, you are a man in the most beautiful, intense sense of the word. You've supported me and helped me, you've let me support and help you, without there being any humiliation on either side. Yes, it would have been good to have an orgasm, but I didn't. But I loved the cold floor, your warm body, the force with which you entered me. I went to take back my library books today, and the librarian asked if I talked to my partner about sex. I felt like saying, "W'th partner? W that sort of sex do you mean?" But she didn't deserve that, she's always been so sweet to me. I've really only had 2 partners since I came to Geneva, one who awoke the worst in me, because I let him and even begged him to. The other one, you, who made me feel part of the world again. I would like to be able to teach you where to touch my body, how much pressure to apply, for how long, and I know you would take this not as a criticism, but as another way to improve communication between our souls. The art of love is like your painting, it requires technique, patience, and, above all, practice by the couple. It requires boldness, the courage to go beyond what people conventionally call making love. The teacher in me was back, and I didn't want that, but Ralph knew how to take control of the situation. Instead of agreeing with me, he lit his 3rd cigarette in less than half an hour and said, "Firstly, you're staying here tonight." It wasn't a request, it was an order. Secondly, we're going to make love again, but with less anxiety this time and more desire. And finally, I'd like you to understand men better too. Understand men better? I spent every night with them, whites, blacks, Asians, Jews, Muslims, Catholics, Buddhists. Didn't Ralph know that? I felt lighter, I was so pleased that the conversation had shifted into being a discussion. At one point, I even considered asking God's forgiveness and breaking my promise. But reality returned, telling me to remember to preserve my dream intact and not to fall into destiny's traps. Yes, to understand men better, said Ralph again, seeing the doubtful look on my face. You talk about your female sexuality, about helping me to find my way around your body, to be patient, to take time. I agree, but has it occurred to you that we're different, at least in matters of time? You should complain to God about that. When we met, I asked you to teach me about sex, because I had lost all my sexual desire. Do you know why? Because after a certain age, every sexual relationship I had ended in tedium and frustration, because I realized how difficult it was to give the women I loved the same amount of pleasure they gave me. I didn't like the sound of the women I loved, but I feigned indifference and lit a cigarette. I didn't have the courage to ask, "Show me your body." But when I met you, I saw your light, and I loved you at once, and I thought that, at this stage in my life, I had nothing to lose by being honest with myself and with the woman I wanted to have by my side. My cigarette tasted delicious, and I would have liked him to offer me some wine, but I didn't want to break the thread of the conversation. Why is it that men only think about sex, instead of doing as you did with me and finding out how I feel? Who said we only think about sex? On the contrary, we spend years of our life trying to convince ourselves that sex is actually important to us. We learn about love from prostitutes or virgins, we tell our stories to whoever will listen. When we are older, we parade about with much younger lovers, just to prove to others that we really are what women expect us to be. But do you know something? That's simply not true. We understand nothing. We think that sex and ejaculation are the same thing and, as you just said, they're not. We don't learn because we haven't the courage to say to the woman, "Show me your body." We don't learn because the woman doesn't have the courage to say, "This is what I like." We are stuck with our primitive survival instincts, and that's that. Absurd though it may seem, do you know what is more important than sex for a man? I thought it might be money or power, but I said nothing. Sport. Because a man can understand another man's body. We can see that sport is a dialogue between two bodies that understand each other. You're mad. Maybe. But it makes sense. Have you ever stopped to think about the feelings of the men you've been to bed with? Yes, I have. They were all insecure. They were all afraid. Worse than afraid, they were vulnerable. They didn't really know what they were doing, they only knew what society, friends, and women themselves had told them was important. Sex, 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 that's the basis of life, scream the advertisements, other people, films, books. No one knows what they're talking about. Since instinct is stronger than all of us, all they know is that it has to be done. And that's that. Enough. I had tried to give him lessons in sex in order to protect myself, now he was doing the same, and however wise our words, because each of us was always trying to impress the other, this was so stupid and so unworthy of our relationship. I drew him to me because, regardless of what he had to say or of what I thought about myself, life had taught me many things. In the beginning, everything was love and surrender. But then the serpent appeared and said to Eve, "What you surrendered, you will lose." That is how it was with me. I was driven out of paradise when I was still at school, and ever since then, I have trying to find a way of telling the serpent he was wrong, that living was more important than keeping things to yourself. But the serpent was right and I knelt down and gradually took off his clothes, and I saw his penis there, sleeping and unresponsive. This didn't seem to bother him, and I kissed the inner part of his legs, starting at his feet. His penis slowly began to respond, and I touched it, then put it in my mouth and, unhurriedly, so that he wouldn't interpret this as, "Right, get ready for action." I kissed it with all the tenderness of someone who expects nothing in return, and for precisely that reason I got everything I wanted. I saw that he was getting excited, and he began to touch my nipples, circling them with his fingers as he had on that night of total darkness, making me want to have him again between my legs or in my mouth or whatever way he wanted to possess me. He didn't take off my jacket, he had me lie face forwards, with the upper part of my body bent over the table, and my feet still on the floor. He penetrated me slowly and unhurriedly this time, no longer afraid of losing me, because, deep DMVN, He too had realized that this was a dream and that it would always be a dream, and would never become reality. At the same time as I felt him inside me, I was aware of his hand on my breasts, my buttocks, touching me as only a woman knows how. Then I knew that we were made for each other, because he could be a woman, as he was now, and I could be a man, as when we talked or when we initiated that joint search for the two lost souls, the two missing fragments needed to complete the verse. As he simultaneously penetrated and touched me, I felt that he was doing this not only to me, but to the whole universe. We had time, tenderness, and mutual knowledge. Yes, it had been good to arrive carrying 2 suitcases, ready to leave, and to be immediately thrown to the floor and penetrated with a kind of fearful urgency, but it was good too knowing that the night would never end and that there, on the kitchen table, orgasm wasn't a goal in itself, but the beginning of that encounter. He stopped moving inside me while his fingers worked quickly and I had 1, 2, teary orgasms in a row. I felt like pushing him away, for the pain of pleasure is so intense that it hurts, but I resisted. I accepted that this was how it was, that I could withstand another orgasm or another 2, or even more. And suddenly, a kind of light exploded inside me. I was no longer myself, but a being infinitely superior to everything I knew. When his hand took me to my 4th orgasm, I entered a place where everything seemed at peace, and with my 5th orgasm I knew God. Then I felt him beginning to move inside me again, although his hand had still not stopped, and I said, "Oh God," and surrendered to whatever came next, heaven or hell. It was heaven. One was the earth, the mountains, the tigers, the rivers that flowed into the lakes that became the sea. He was thrusting faster and faster now, and the pain was mingled with pleasure, and I could have said, "I can't take any more," but that would have been unfair, because, by then, he and I were one person. I allowed him to penetrate me for as long as it took. His nails were now digging into my buttocks, and there I was face D0MN on the kitchen table, thinking that there wasn't a better place in the world to make love. Again the creak of the table, his breathing growing ever faster, his nails bruising me, my sex beating hard against his, flesh against flesh, bone against bone, and I was about to have another orgasm, and so was he, and none of this, absolutely none of this was a lie. "Come on." He knew what he was saying, and I knew that this was the moment. I felt my whole body soften. I ceased to be myself. I was no longer listening, seeing, or tasting anything. I was merely feeling. "Come on." And I came at the same moment he came. It wasn't 11 minutes, it was an eternity. It was as if we had both left our bodies and were walking joyfully through the gardens of paradise in understanding and friendship. I was woman and man, he was man and woman. I don't know how long it lasted, but everything seemed to be silent, at prayer, as if the universe and life had ceased to exist and become transformed into something sacred, nameless, and timeless. But time returned. I heard his shouts and I shouted with him, the table legs beat on the floor, and it didn't occur to either of us to wonder what the rest of the world might be thinking. And suddenly he withdrew from me and laughed. I felt my vagina contract, and I turned to him and I laughed too, and we embraced as if it were the first time we had made love in our entire lives. "Bless me," he said. I blessed him, not really knowing what I was doing. I asked him to do the same, and he did, saying, "Blessed be this woman, who has loved much." They were beautiful words, and we embraced again and stayed there, unable to understand how 11 minutes could carry a man and a woman so far. Neither of us was tired. We went into the living room. He put on a record and did exactly as I had hoped. He lit the fire and poured me some wine. Then he opened a book and read, "A time to be born, and a time to die, a time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to break down, and a time to build up, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance, a time to cast away stones, and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to get, and a time to lose, a time to keep, and a time to cast away, a time to rend, and a time to sow, a time to keep silence, and a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate, a time of war, and a time of peace. This sounded like a farewell, but it was the loveliest farewell I would ever experience in my life. I embraced him and he embraced me, and we lay d0mm on the carpet beside the fire. I was still filled by a sense of plenitude, as if I had always been a wise, happy, fulfilled woman. What made you fall in love with a prostitute? I didn't understand it myself at the time. But I've thought about it since, and I think it was because, knowing that your body would never be mine alone, I had to concentrate on conquering your soul. Weren't you jealous? You can't say to the spring, come now and last as long as possible. You can only say, come and bless me with your hope, and stay as long as you words lost on the wind. But I needed to hear them, and he needed to say them. I fell asleep, although I don't know when. I dreamed, not of a situation or of a person, but of a perfume that flooded the air. When Maria opened her eyes, a few rays of sun were coming in through the open blinds. I've made love with him twice, she thought, looking at the man asleep by her side. And yet it's as if we had always been together, and he had always known my life, my soul, my body, my light, my pain. She got up to go to the kitchen and make some coffee. That was when she saw the 2 suitcases in the hall and she remembered everything, her promise, the prayer she had said in the church, her life, the dream that insisted on becoming reality and losing its charm, the perfect man, the love in which body and soul were one and the same and in which pleasure and orgasm were different things. She could stay, she had nothing more to lose, only an illusion. She remembered the poem, a time to weep, and a time to laugh. But there was another line too, a time to embrace, and a time to refrain from embracing. She made the coffee, shut the kitchen door and phoned for a taxi. She summoned all her willpower, which had carried her so far, and which was the source of energy for her light, which had told her the exact time to leave, which was protecting her and making her treasure forever the memory of that night. She got dressed, picked up her suitcases and left, hoping against hope that he would wake up and ask her to stay. But he didn't wake up. While she was waiting for the taxi outside, a gypsy was passing, carrying bouquets of flowers. Would you like to buy one? Maria bought one. It was the sign that autumn had arrived and summer had been left behind. It would be a long time now before the cafe tables were out on the pavements in Geneva and the parks were full once more of people strolling about and sunbathing. It didn't matter, she was leaving because she had chosen to leave, and there was no reason for regrets. She got to the airport, drank another cup of coffee and waited 4 hours for her flight to Paris, thinking all the time that he would arrive at any moment, because at some point before they fell asleep, she had told him the time of her flight. That's how it always happened in films. At the last moment, when the woman is just about to board the plane, the man races up to her, puts his arms around her and kisses her, and brings her back to his world, beneath the smiling, indulgent gaze of the flight staff. The words "the end" appear on the screen, and the audience knows that, from then on, they will live happily ever after. Films never tell you what happens next, she thought, trying to console herself. Marriage, cooking, children, ever more infrequent sex, the discovery of the first note from his mistress, the decision to confront him, his promise that it will never happen again, the second note from another mistress, another confrontation, and least time a threat to leave him. This time the man reacts less vehemently and merely tells her that he loves her. The third note from a third mistress, and the decision to say nothing, to pretend that she knows nothing, because he might tell her that he doesn't love her anymore and that she's free to leave. No, films never show that. They finish before the real world begins. It's best not to think too much about it. She read 1, 2, 3 magazines. In the end, they announced her flight, after almost an eternity in that airport lounge, and she got on the plane. She still imagined the famous scene in which, as she fastens her seat belt, she feels a hand on her shoulder, turns round, and there he is, smiling at her. Nothing happened. She slept on the short flight between Geneva and Paris. She hadn't had time to think of what she would tell them at home, what story she would invent, but her parents would probably just happy to have their daughter back, and to have a farm and a comfortable old age ahead of them. She woke up with the jolt of the plane landing. It taxied for a long time, and the flight attendant came to tell her that she would have to change terminals, because the flight to Brazil left from Terminal F and she was in Terminal C. But there was no need to worry, there were no delays, and she still had plenty of time, and if she wasn't sure where to go, the ground staff would help her. While the passenger loading bridge was put in place, she wondered if it would be worth spending a day in Paris, just to take some photographs and be able to tell people that she had been there. She needed time to think, to be alone with herself, to bury her memories of last night deep down inside her, so that she could use them whenever she needed to feel alive. Yes, a day in Paris was an excellent idea. She asked the flight attendant when the next flight to Brazil was, if she decided not to leave that day. The flight attendant asked to see her ticket and said that, unfortunately, it didn't allow for that kind of stopover. Maria consoled herself with the thought that visiting such a beautiful city all on her own would only depress her. She was still managing to cling on to her sang-froid, to her willpower, and didn't want to ruin it all by seeing a beautiful view and missing someone intensely. She got off the plane and went through the security checks. Her luggage would go straight onto the next plane, so she didn't have to bother with that. The doors opened, the passengers emerged and embraced whoever was waiting for them, wife, mother, children. Maria pretended not to notice, at the same time pondering her own loneliness, except that this time she had a secret, a dream, which would make her solitude less bitter, and life would be easier. We'll always have Paris. The voice didn't belong to a tourist guide or to a taxi driver. Her legs shook when she heard it. We'll always have Paris. It's a quote from one of my favorite films. Would you like to see the Eiffel Tower? Oh, yes, she would love to. Ralph was holding a bunch of roses, and his eyes were full of light, the light she had seen on that first day, when he was painting her while the cold wind outside had made her feel awkward to be sitting there. How did you manage to get here before me? She asked, merely to disguise her amazement. She wasn't in the least interested in the answer, but she needed a breathing space. I saw you reading a magazine at Geneva Airport. I could have come over, but I'm such an incurable romantic that I thought it would be best to catch the next shuttle to Paris, wander about the airport here for 3 hours, consult the arrivals screen over and over, buy some flowers, say the words that Rick says to his beloved in Casablanca and see the look of surprise on your face. And to be utterly sure that this was what you wanted, that you were expecting me, that all the determination and willpower in the world would not be enough to prevent love from changing the rules of the game from one moment to the next. It's really easy being as romantic as people in the movies, don't you think? She had no idea whether it was easy or difficult, and she didn't honestly care, even though she had only just met this man, even though they had made love for the first time only a few hours before, even though she had only been introduced to his friends the previous evening, even though he had been a regular at the nightclub where she had worked, even though he had been married twice. These were not exactly impeccable credentials. On the other hand, she now had enough money to buy a farm, she had her youth ahead of her, a great deal of experience of life and a great independence of soul. Nevertheless, as always happened when fate chose for her, she thought, once again, that she would take the risk. She kissed him, utterly indifferent now to what happens after the words "the end" appear on the cinema screen. But if, one day, someone should decide to tell her story, she would ask them to begin it just as all the fairy tales begin, once upon a time.